in the dying embers of a kingdom torn asunder by a century of war, when hope had become a stranger to the French people and their uncrowned king cowered behind the Loire River, something impossible was about to happen. The year was 1429. England held Paris, controlled most of northern France, and their Burgundian allies dominated the east. The Dauphin Charles, mockingly called the King of Bourges, ruled over a shrinking territory, while his own nobles questioned whether he was even the legitimate heir to the throne. France was not merely losing a war, it was ceasing to exist. Yet in this darkest hour, from the most unlikely of places, would emerge one of history's most extraordinary figures. Not a seasoned general, hardened by decades of warfare. Not a powerful duke with vast armies at his command. Not a learned theologian who could rally the church to France's defence, but a 17-year-old peasant girl who could neither read nor write, who had never held a sword or worn armour, who had spent her childhood tending sheep and spinning wool in an obscure village on the eastern frontier. What unfolded over the next 2 years defies every expectation we might have about medieval society, about military strategy, about the nature of faith itself. This illiterate teenager would convince a desperate king to entrust her with an army. She would lift a 7-month siege in 7 days. She would crown a king in enemy territory. She would be captured, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake before her 20th birthday. And somehow through all of this she would save France and change the course of European history. This is not a tale of gradual transformation or steady progress. This is the story of a lightning strike that illuminated an entire kingdom, burned with impossible brightness, and was extinguished almost as quickly as it had appeared. Yet its light would never truly die, echoing through 6 centuries to inspire revolutionaries and reactionaries, feminists and traditionalists, believers and skeptics alike. To understand Joan of Arc, we must first understand the France into which she was born. We must grasp the depth of the crisis that made her mission necessary, the religious world that shaped her visions, and the political machinery that would first elevate and then destroy her. We must see through the eyes of those who followed her into battle, those who condemned her to death, and those who would spend the next 500 years trying to explain what had happened in those 2 extraordinary years. Tonight, as we journey through this remarkable saga, we will encounter kings and peasants, saints and sinners, voices from heaven and the flames of execution. We will witness military strategies that shouldn't have worked but did, theological arguments that determine the fate of nations, and political betrayals that echo with shame across the centuries. We will see how a teenage girl's absolute conviction collided with the cynical realities of medieval power, and how, against all odds, her faith proved stronger than their politics. But before we can meet the Maid of Orleans, before we can hear her voices or follow her banner into battle, we must first understand the 100-year tragedy that made her necessary. We must witness the slow collapse of the greatest kingdom in Christendom, the civil war that tore it apart from within, and the moment when all seemed lost. Only then can we appreciate the full magnitude of what one young woman achieved in the face of impossible odds. The seeds of France's destruction were sown on a fog-shrouded morning in 1328, when Charles IV died without a male heir, ending the direct Capetian line that had ruled France for 3 centuries. What followed was not merely a succession dispute, but the beginning of a conflict that would consume generations, destroy entire provinces, and reduce the most powerful kingdom in Europe to the edge of annihilation. Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV of France, through his mother Isabella, claimed the French throne by right of blood. The French nobility, invoking the ancient Salic law that barred inheritance through the female line, crowned Philip VI of the House of Valois instead. It was a legal technicality that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. At first the conflict simmered rather than blazed. Edward III, occupied with Scottish wars and domestic concerns, initially accepted Philip VI's coronation. But when Philip attempted to confiscate England's valuable Duchy of Gascony in 1337, Edward reasserted his claim to the French throne, and the 100 Years' War began in earnest. No one could have imagined it would last until 1453, spanning 5 generations of kings and transforming both nations beyond recognition. The early decades of the war revealed a shocking truth that would haunt France for a century. Their traditional military superiority, based on heavily armoured noble cavalry, was obsolete. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen slaughtered the flower of French chivalry, their arrows punching through expensive armour as if it were parchment. At Poitiers in 1356, the catastrophe was even worse. Not only was the French army destroyed, but King John II himself was captured, leaving France rudderless and humiliated. The capture of a king was more than a military defeat. It was a cosmic disruption of the natural order. Medieval society depended on the belief that God ordained social hierarchies, that kings ruled by divine right, that the strong protected the weak. When English archers, common men, peasants even, could destroy princes and capture kings, the very foundations of society trembled. France's agony was compounded by the Black Death, which arrived in 1348 and killed perhaps a third of the population. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay fallow. Trade routes collapsed. The survivors faced not only grief and fear, but economic catastrophe as the traditional structures of rural life disintegrated. Peasant rebellions erupted across the kingdom, most notably the Jacquerie of 1358, when desperate farmers rose against nobles who had failed to protect them from either plague or English raiders. Meanwhile, companies of unemployed soldiers, the infamous free companies, roamed the countryside like packs of wolves. These routiers, as they were called, were theoretically loyal to whoever paid them, but in practice they were loyal only to plunder. They besieged towns, burned villages, held nobles for ransom, and turned large swaths of France into lawless wastelands where only the strong or the hidden survived. By 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny seemed to offer respite. Edward III renounced his claim to the French throne in exchange for complete sovereignty over an enlarged Aquitaine. But peace was merely an intermission in the tragedy. Both kingdoms used the respite to rearm and prepare for the next act. When war resumed in 1369, under Edward's son, the Black Prince, and France's new king, Charles V, the conflict took on an even more bitter character. Charles V, known as the Wise, understood that France could not defeat England through traditional battlefield confrontations. Instead, he adopted a strategy of gradual attrition, avoiding major battles while slowly reclaiming territory through sieges and guerrilla warfare. His constable, Bertrand du Guesclin, perfected these tactics, refusing glorious cavalry charges in favour of patient, methodical warfare that gradually pushed the English back to a narrow strip along the coast. For a brief moment, it seemed France might recover. Charles V rebuilt the administration, reformed the tax system, and created a professional army. French confidence returned. The nightmare appeared to be ending. Then in 1380, everything fell apart again. Charles V died at only 42, leaving the throne to Charles VI, a boy of 11. What followed was a catastrophe that would make all previous French disasters seem mild by comparison. At first, the boy king's uncles ruled as regents, enriching themselves, while the kingdom's finances collapsed. When Charles VI reached his majority and took personal control, there was brief hope for renewal. He was young, energetic, and determined to restore French glory. But in August 1392, while leading an expedition through the forest of Le Mans on a blazingly hot day, Charles VI suddenly went insane. He attacked his own men, killing 4 knights before being subdued. When he recovered, he couldn't remember what had happened. It was the beginning of a madness that would periodically incapacitate him for the rest of his life. The king's insanity created a power vacuum that two men rushed to fill: Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, the king's cousin. Their rivalry would tear France apart more thoroughly than any English invasion. Louis of Orleans was everything a medieval prince was supposed to be: handsome, cultured, a patron of the arts, and a legendary lover. He controlled the king during his lucid periods, through charm and persuasion. John of Burgundy was his opposite: calculating, methodical, and pragmatic. He appealed to the merchants of Paris and the common people by promising reform and lower taxes. The rivalry between Orleans and Burgundy went beyond personal ambition. It represented two different visions of France. Orleans stood for the traditional monarchy, centralised and hierarchical. Burgundy represented a more federal vision, with greater autonomy for the great duchies. Orleans drew his support from the south and centre of France, Burgundy from the north and east. On the night of November 23rd, 1407, the conflict exploded into civil war. Louis of Orleans was returning from visiting the Queen when masked men emerged from the shadows of the Rue Vieille du Temple in Paris. They hacked him to pieces, leaving his mutilated body in the gutter. Within days, John the Fearless publicly admitted he had ordered the assassination, claiming he had acted to save France from a tyrant. The murder of Louis of Orleans split France into two irreconcilable factions: the Armagnacs, named after the Count of Armagnac, who led the Orleans party after Louis's death, and the Burgundians. What followed was not merely political rivalry, but genuine civil war. Armies marched and countermarched across France. Paris changed hands repeatedly, each transfer accompanied by massacres of the opposing faction. The English, watching from across the Channel, could hardly believe their good fortune. Henry V of England, young, ambitious, and brilliantly opportunistic, invaded France in 1415 just as the Civil War reached its peak of savagery. The Armagnacs and Burgundians were so busy destroying each other that they could barely organise resistance. At Agincourt on October 25th, 1415, Henry's small army of perhaps 9,000 men faced a French force of 20,000. It should have been an English catastrophe. Instead, it became the greatest English victory of the war. The French nobility, forgetting every lesson of Crécy and Poitiers, charged across a muddy field directly into a storm of English arrows. The battlefield became a slaughter pen. Thousands of France's greatest nobles died in the mud, trampled by their own comrades or executed by English soldiers. The Constable of France, 3 dukes, 8 counts, and an archbishop were among the dead. An entire generation of French leadership was wiped out in a single afternoon. After Agincourt, French resistance crumbled. Henry V methodically conquered Normandy, taking Rouen after a brutal siege where the defenders were reduced to eating rats and leather. The Burgundians, seeing which way the wind was blowing, allied openly with England. On September 10th, 1419, during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation on the bridge at Montereau, Armagnac soldiers murdered John the Fearless in revenge for Louis of Orleans. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, immediately allied with Henry V, declaring that he would rather see his sister married to the English king than make peace with his father's murderers. The Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21st, 1420, seemed to seal France's fate. Charles VI, in one of his lucid periods but under complete English and Burgundian control, disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, declaring him illegitimate. Henry V would marry Charles VI's daughter Catherine, and their children would inherit both England and France. The treaty was ratified by the Estates General, giving it the colour of law. France, as an independent kingdom, was scheduled for extinction. The Dauphin Charles, only 17 years old, fled south of the Loire River with the remnants of the Armagnac party. He set up a rump court at Bourges, claiming to be the legitimate heir, but few took him seriously. Even his own supporters whispered that he might indeed be illegitimate, the product of his mother Isabeau's numerous affairs. Charles himself was tormented by doubt. His father had officially disowned him. His mother had agreed to the Treaty of Troyes. Perhaps he wasn't the true heir, after all. Henry V and Charles VI both died in 1422, leaving the infant Henry VI as nominal king of both England and France, with the Duke of Bedford ruling as regent. Bedford was a skilled administrator and competent general who might have succeeded in making the dual monarchy a reality. But he faced one insurmountable problem. The Dauphin Charles, despite all his weakness and self-doubt, refused to give up. The Dauphin's situation by 1428 was desperate, but not quite hopeless. He controlled the territory south of the Loire River, roughly a third of France. He had the support of powerful nobles like the Duke of Alençon and the Count of Dunois. He had the theoretical legitimacy of being Charles VI's son, whatever the Treaty of Troyes might say. But he lacked the resources for a major military campaign, the confidence to assert his authority, and most critically, he lacked any sign that God favoured his cause. Medieval people did not separate political and religious authority the way modern societies do. A king ruled by the grace of God. Military victory was a sign of divine favour. Defeat meant God's displeasure. The string of English victories from Crécy to Agincourt to the conquest of Normandy seemed to prove that God wanted England to rule France. The Dauphin's inability to be crowned at Reims, the traditional site where French kings received the holy oil that transformed them from mere nobles into God's anointed, meant he was not truly king at all, just a pretender clinging to a lost cause. By October 1428, the English had begun their final offensive to destroy the Dauphin's party once and for all. Their target was Orléans, the last major city north of the Loire still loyal to Charles. Orléans was more than strategically important. It was symbolically crucial. It was the city of the murdered Duke Louis, the heart of anti-Burgundian resistance. If it fell, the Loire Valley would be defenceless. The English could march on Bourges and end the war. The siege of Orléans began on October 12, 1428, when English forces under the Earl of Salisbury arrived before the city walls. Salisbury was one of England's best generals, a veteran of dozens of campaigns. He began methodically, seizing the fortified bridge over the Loire and its gatehouse, Les Tourelles, cutting the city off from the south. He built a ring of fortifications around the city, each one a small wooden fortress bristling with cannons and archers. Inside Orléans, the defenders under Jean de Dunois, the illegitimate half-brother of the murdered Duke of Orléans, prepared for a long siege. They had perhaps 2,400 soldiers and militia against 5,000 English troops. The walls were strong, the city well provisioned, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Every other major siege of the war had ended the same way: eventual surrender or starvation. The one glimmer of hope came on October 27th, when the Earl of Salisbury was inspecting the Les Tourelles fortress. He was standing at a window, surveying the city, when a cannon shot from the walls struck the window frame. A splinter of stone tore through his face, destroying one eye and lodging in his brain. He died in agony 8 days later. The English were shocked. Salisbury had survived countless battles only to be killed by a random shot. Some saw it as divine justice for attacking Orléans during the feast of Saint-Aignan, the city's patron saint. But Salisbury's death only delayed the inevitable. The Earl of Suffolk took command, tightening the siege through the winter of 1428-29. Inside the city, food grew scarce. The defenders launched desperate sorties that achieved nothing except more casualties. The Dauphin sent a relief convoy in February 1429, but it was intercepted and destroyed at the Battle of the Herrings, so called because the English were defending a supply train of salted fish for Lent. The defeat at the Battle of the Herrings seemed to extinguish the last hope for Orléans. The Dauphin's court at Bourges fell into despair. Some nobles began secret negotiations with the English and Burgundians. Others simply fled to their estates to wait out the inevitable English victory. The Dauphin himself, always prone to melancholy, sank into depression. He was 26 years old, had been fighting for his inheritance for 8 years, and had nothing to show for it but a shrinking territory and a mocking nickname, the King of Bourges. It was at this moment, when French resistance was at its lowest ebb, when the kingdom that had existed since Clovis seemed about to vanish forever, that extraordinary rumours began to reach the Dauphin's court. From the eastern frontier, from a region so remote that many courtiers couldn't locate it on a map, came word of a young girl claiming that voices from heaven had commanded her to save France. She was said to be a peasant, completely uneducated, who had never travelled more than a few miles from her village. Yet she insisted that she would raise the siege of Orléans, see the Dauphin crowned at Reims, and drive the English from France. The courtiers at Bourges, sophisticated men who had spent their lives in the complex world of medieval politics, must have thought it was a joke. A peasant girl who heard voices, who claimed saints appeared to her and gave her military advice, who dressed in men's clothing and demanded to lead armies. It was absurd, impossible, perhaps blasphemous. The Dauphin had been approached by dozens of mystics and prophets claiming divine missions. Why should this one be different? But as winter turned to spring in 1429, as Orléans grew weaker and the English grew stronger, as the last hope of saving the kingdom flickered and died, some began to wonder, what if the girl was telling the truth? What if, in this darkest hour, God had finally decided to intervene? Not through a mighty prince or a learned theologian, but through the most unlikely vessel imaginable, an illiterate teenage girl from the margins of the kingdom. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the east, in a small village on the Meuse River, where France, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire met in an uncertain frontier, that very girl was preparing for a journey that would change everything. She had been hearing her voices for 4 years, had kept them secret from everyone except her priest, had tried to live a normal life despite the increasingly urgent commands that echoed in her mind. But the voices would no longer be denied. St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret appeared to her almost daily now, their messages growing more specific and more urgent. She must go to the Dauphin. She must save Orléans. She must see him crowned at Reims. She had perhaps a year to accomplish all of this before she would be captured. The fate of France, the voices insisted, rested in the hands of a 17-year-old girl who had never travelled beyond the nearest market town. In the cottage where she lived with her parents, Joan of Arc, though she never called herself that in life, being known simply as Jeanne la Pucelle, Joan the Maid, prepared to obey her voices. She had no idea how she would convince anyone to listen to her. She had no military training, no powerful connections, no education beyond what she had learned in church. She had only absolute certainty that God had chosen her for this mission. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, had been having nightmares about his daughter running away with soldiers. He had told his sons that if Joan ever did such a thing, they should drown her, and if they wouldn't, he would do it himself. Her mother, Isabelle Romay, known for her piety and her pilgrimage to Rome, watched her youngest daughter with growing concern. Joan had always been religious, but lately she seemed consumed by something beyond normal devotion. The village of Domremy itself bore the scars of the war that had ravaged France for nearly a century. It had been burned by Burgundian raiders in 1425, forcing the inhabitants to flee to nearby Neufchâteau. The village lay in a curious position, technically part of France, but surrounded by Burgundian territory, isolated from the main currents of French politics, but constantly reminded of the war by raids, requisitions, and rumours of battles fought just over the horizon. It was from this unlikely place that salvation would come. Not from Paris, occupied by the English, not from Bourges, where the Dauphin held his diminished court, not from the great duchies with their powerful armies, but from a cottage on the edge of the kingdom, where a teenage girl was about to attempt the impossible. As January 1429 dawned cold and uncertain, as the defenders of Orléans counted their dwindling supplies, as the English tightened their siege lines, as the Dauphin contemplated exile in Scotland or Spain, Joan made her decision. Despite her father's threats, despite her mother's tears, despite the sheer impossibility of what she was attempting, she would obey her voices. She would go to the local garrison commander at Vaucouleurs, a man named Robert de Baudricourt, who had the authority to send messages to the Dauphin. She would convince him, somehow, that God had sent her to save France. She would get him to provide her with an escort to travel the hundreds of miles through enemy territory to the Dauphin's court. She would persuade a king she had never met to entrust her with an army. She would lift a siege that had defeated professional generals. She would crown a doubting prince in a cathedral held by his enemies. The summer of 1425 brought unusual heat to the Meuse Valley. In the village of Domremy, the air hung heavy and still, broken only by the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to prayer. It was noon, that liminal hour when the medieval world paused between the labours of morning and afternoon, when shadows disappeared and the sun stood directly overhead like the eye of God examining his creation. Joan, 13 years old, was in her father's garden behind their stone cottage. The garden was her refuge, a small plot where vegetables grew in neat rows and herbs released their fragrance into the warm air. She had been working since dawn, as she did every day, helping with the endless tasks that kept a peasant household functioning, feeding the chickens, mending clothes, preparing meals. But at noon, she often found herself here, in this quiet space between the cottage and the fields, where she could be alone with her thoughts and her prayers. She would remember this moment for the rest of her short life. Every detail would remain vivid, the texture of the soil beneath her bare feet, the buzz of insects in the summer heat, the smell of growing things mixing with smoke from the village hearths. And then suddenly, the world changed. From the direction of the church came a light brighter than the sun, though the day was cloudless. It was not the harsh light of lightning or fire, but something altogether different, a radiance that seemed to carry weight and presence, that made the very air shimmer with significance. And within that light, or perhaps composed of it, was a voice. The voice was male, authoritative, but not harsh, speaking French with an accent she couldn't place, neither the local dialect of Lorraine, nor the courtly French she sometimes heard from visiting nobles. The words were simple, almost mundane. Be good. Go to church. Live a worthy life. But the effect on Joan was profound. She fell to her knees, not from fear, but from recognition. Somehow, in a way she could never adequately explain, she knew this voice came from heaven. When the light faded and the voice fell silent, Joan remained kneeling in the garden, trembling not with fear, but with a kind of electric awareness. The world looked the same, the cottage, the vegetables, the distant fields, but everything had changed. She had been touched by something beyond the ordinary flow of life, selected for reasons she couldn't yet understand. She told no one, not even her priest, during confession. How could she explain what she barely comprehended herself? Over the following weeks, the voice returned, always at the hour of church bells, always accompanied by that extraordinary light. Gradually, the speaker revealed himself. He was Michael the Archangel, captain of the heavenly host, the warrior who had cast Satan from heaven, the protector of France. The choice of Michael was significant in ways Joan wouldn't fully understand until later. He was the patron saint of soldiers, the defender against evil, the one who would weigh souls at the last judgment. That he should appear to a peasant girl in an obscure village suggested something extraordinary was beginning. As autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, Michael was joined by two female saints. Saint Catherine of Alexandria appeared first, a virgin martyr who had confounded 50 philosophers with her wisdom. before being executed on a spiked wheel. She was young, perhaps not much older than Joan herself appeared to be, with a voice that combined authority with compassion. Then came Saint Margaret of Antioch, another virgin martyr, who had maintained her faith despite torture and temptation. Both saints were beloved in medieval France, their stories told and retold in sermons and mystery plays, their images painted in churches and carved in stone. These three, Michael the warrior, Catherine the wise, and Margaret the steadfast, would become Joan's constant companions for the rest of her life. They appeared to her 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more during crucial periods. She saw them, she would later testify, as clearly as she saw living people. They had faces and bodies, wore crowns of gold, smelled of roses and incense. They were as real to her as her parents. More real, perhaps, because they came from a realm beyond the changes and chances of mortal life. At first, the messages remained personal and spiritual. Joan must maintain her virginity, dedicating her purity to God. She must be charitable to the poor, even when her own family had little to spare. She must attend Mass daily if possible, confess regularly, and receive communion with proper devotion. These were not unusual requirements. Many devout young women followed similar practices, but the supernatural source gave them special weight. Joan threw herself into religious life with an intensity that both impressed and worried her parents. She gave her own food to beggars, slept on the floor so vagrants could have her bed, spent hours in prayer when other girls her age were gossiping or dancing. The village priest, Father Jean Fournier, noticed her exceptional devotion, but saw nothing heretical or dangerous in it. She was simply an extraordinarily pious girl in an age that valued piety. But as 1427 progressed, the messages from her voices began to change. They spoke less of personal holiness and more of France's suffering. They told her about battles she had never heard of, described the Dauphin she had never seen, explained political situations far beyond her experience or education. Michael showed her visions of French soldiers fleeing before English arrows, of cities burning, of the kingdom itself dissolving like salt in water. The transformation in the messages accelerated in 1428. Now the voices spoke of specific missions. Joan must go to the Dauphin Charles. She must tell him that God had sent her to help him become the true King of France. She must raise the siege of Orléans, see Charles crowned at Reims, and drive the English from French soil. The commands were precise, urgent, and completely impossible for a peasant girl to fulfill. Joan's response to these evolving messages reveals much about her character. A different person might have dismissed the voices as delusions, sought treatment for what modern medicine might diagnose as temporal lobe epilepsy or schizophrenia. Another might have embraced them as divine, while recognizing the impossibility of acting on them, living a life of private mysticism without public action. But Joan possessed a quality that would define her short life: absolute certainty combined with practical determination. She began to prepare. Without telling anyone why, she learned to ride horses, borrowing mounts from her father's friends, and teaching herself to stay seated at a gallop. She observed the men-at-arms who occasionally passed through Domremy, studying how they moved in armour, how they held their weapons. She listened intently to news from the war, memorising names of commanders, locations of battles, the complex web of allegiances that defined the conflict. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, began having disturbing dreams. He saw his daughter riding away with soldiers, dressed as a man, lost to shame and scandal. In the medieval world, women who followed armies had only one reputation, regardless of their actual behaviour. The dreams tormented him so much that he told his sons to watch their sister carefully, threatening to drown her himself if she ever tried to run away with soldiers. Joan's internal struggle during this period must have been agonising. She was caught between absolute certainty that God had commanded her to act and the practical impossibility of obeying. She was a minor subject to her father's authority. She was female in a world that gave women no public voice. She was poor, uneducated, and unknown. Every structure of medieval society stood between her and the mission her voices demanded. The crisis came to a head in October 1428, when news arrived that the English had begun besieging Orléans. Joan's voices became insistent, appearing daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Catherine and Margaret wept as they described the suffering of Orléans' defenders. Michael's voice took on a tone of command that brooked no refusal. The time for preparation was over. Joan must act now, or France would be lost. It was then that Joan conceived her plan. 16 miles from Domremy lay the fortress town of Vaucouleurs, commanded by Robert de Baudricourt, a minor noble who remained loyal to the Dauphin. If she could convince Baudricourt to listen to her, he had the authority to send her to the royal court. It was a slim chance. Why would a garrison commander pay attention to a peasant girl? But it was the only chance she had. To reach Baudricourt, Joan needed help from someone her father wouldn't suspect. She turned to Durand-Lassois, her mother's cousin, a respectable farmer who lived near Vaucouleurs. She told him she needed to visit him and his wife, claiming she wanted to help with the birth of their expected child. It was the first of many deceptions she would employ, not from malice but from necessity. The voices had commanded her to act, and she would find a way to obey, even if it meant deceiving those she loved. In January 1429, Joan arrived at her cousin's house in Bury-le-Petit, just outside Vaucouleurs. She stayed with Durand and his wife for several days, helping with household chores, giving no sign of her real purpose. Then, choosing her moment carefully, she revealed the truth to Durand. God had sent her to save France. She needed him to arrange a meeting with Robert de Baudricourt. Durand's reaction is not recorded, but we can imagine his shock. His young cousin, this girl he had known since childhood, claimed to hear voices from heaven, claimed she would save the kingdom. It must have seemed like madness, yet something about Joan's certainty, her complete lack of doubt or hesitation, must have been compelling. Against all reason, Durand agreed to help. The first meeting with Baudricourt was a disaster. The garrison commander was a practical soldier, a minor noble who had survived decades of war through careful political manoeuvring. He had no time for peasant mystics. When Durand presented Joan and she announced that God had sent her to save France, Baudricourt's response was predictable and crude. He told Durand to take the girl home and tell her father to give her a good beating. But Joan didn't return to Domremy. Instead, she remained in Vaucouleurs, staying with Henri and Catherine Leroyer, a local couple who were moved by her obvious devotion. She attended Mass daily at the chapel, prayed for hours, and spoke to anyone who would listen about her divine mission. Gradually, word spread through the town about the strange girl who claimed to hear voices. The people of Vaucouleurs were more receptive to Joan's message than their commander had been. They lived on the frontier of war, had seen their town besieged, their fields burned, their neighbours killed or carried off. They knew that conventional military efforts had failed, that the Dauphin's cause seemed hopeless. Perhaps God would intervene through an unlikely vessel. Hadn't he chosen David, a shepherd boy, to defeat Goliath? Hadn't he worked through Judith, a woman, to save the Israelites? An old prophecy began to circulate, attributed variously to Merlin, Bede, or Marie d'Avignon. France will be lost by a woman and saved by a virgin from the marches of Lorraine. The woman who lost France was clearly Queen Isabeau, who had signed the Treaty of Troyes disinheriting her own son. Could Joan be the virgin from Lorraine who would restore what the Queen had destroyed? As Joan waited in Vaucouleurs, her voices continued to guide her. They told her specific things that would happen, information she couldn't possibly have known through natural means. On February 12th, 1429, she suddenly announced to the Le Royer that the Dauphin's forces had suffered a terrible defeat that very day near Orléans. The claim seemed absurd. Orléans was over 150 miles away, and no messenger could have brought news so quickly. But Joan was insistent. The French had been defeated while trying to intercept an English supply convoy. Many good men had died. When messengers arrived days later with news of the Battle of the Herrings, so called because the English had been defending a convoy of salted fish, fought on February 12th exactly as Joan had described, the effect on Vaucouleurs was electric. The girl had known what was happening hundreds of miles away. She had seen it through divine revelation. Even skeptics began to wonder if she might be what she claimed. Jean de Metz, a young squire in Baudricourt's service, was among those intrigued by Joan. He sought her out, finding her in the chapel where she spent most of her time. His question was blunt. "What are you doing here? Must the king be driven from his kingdom and all of us become English?" Joan's answer, recorded in Jean de Metz's later testimony, was equally direct. "I have come to this royal town to speak to Robert de Baudricourt, that he might deign to take me or have me taken to the king. But he pays no attention to me or my words. Nevertheless, before mid-Lent, I must be with the king, even if I must wear my legs down to the knees going to him. For no one in the world, neither kings nor dukes nor the daughter of the King of Scotland, nor anyone else can recover the kingdom of France. There is no help except through me, although I would prefer to stay home and spin wool with my mother, for this is not my proper station. But I must go, and I must do this, because my lord wishes me to do it." Jean de Metz was a soldier, trained to judge people quickly and accurately. His life often depended on knowing whom to trust. Something about Joan, her certainty, her lack of personal ambition, her obvious distress at being called to this mission, convinced him. He asked who her lord was. When she replied God, he placed his hands between hers in the feudal gesture of fealty and swore to help her reach the king. Bertrand de Poulenchy, another young squire, was similarly moved. Together with Jean de Metz, he began to organise an escort to take Joan to the Dauphin. They understood the dangers involved. The journey to Chinon, where Charles held court, was over 350 miles through territory, crawling with a Burgundian and English patrols. A small party would have to travel at night, avoiding main roads, trusting to luck and speed to avoid capture. There was also the problem of Joan's appearance. A young woman travelling with soldiers would be assumed to be a camp follower, a prostitute. She would be in constant danger of rape or murder. The solution, proposed by Joan's voices and embraced with practical necessity, was for her to travel as a man. Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulenchy provided her with male clothing, a tunic, hose, boots, and spurs. They cut her hair in the short pudding bowl style worn by pages. The transformation must have been shocking to those who knew Joan. In medieval society, clothing was identity. Sumptuary laws dictated what each class could wear. For a woman to dress as a man was not merely unusual, but transgressive, a violation of both social norms and biblical commandments. Yet Joan accepted it as necessary for her mission. She would later say that she wore men's clothes on the command of God, and would continue to do so until her mission was complete. Robert de Baudricourt, meanwhile, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. The people of Vaucouleurs had embraced Joan as a prophet. His own squires were organising to help her. News of the girl who knew about the Battle of the Herrings had spread throughout the region. If he continued to refuse her, and Orléans fell as a result, he might be blamed for ignoring a divine messenger. But if he sent her to the Dauphin, and she proved to be deluded or fraudulent, he would be ridiculed. Finally, Baudricourt decided on a test. He brought the parish priest to examine Joan, to sprinkle her with holy water, and command any demons to depart. Joan submitted calmly to the examination, showing no fear of the holy water or sacred words. The priest found nothing demonic about her, only exceptional piety and conviction. With no more excuses to delay, Baudricourt made his decision. On February 22nd, 1429, he authorised Joan to travel to Chinon. He provided her with a horse, a sword, and a formal letter of introduction to the Dauphin. His parting words, recorded by witnesses, were resigned rather than enthusiastic. Go and come what may. As Joan prepared to leave Vaucouleurs, her voices gave her specific instructions. She would travel safely to Chinon, despite the dangers. The Dauphin would receive her, though many would oppose her. She would recognize him despite never having seen him. She would tell him a secret that would convince him of her divine mission. She would receive an army and raise the siege of Orléans. All of this would happen quickly, for she had only a year, perhaps a little more, before she would be captured. The prophecy of her capture must have chilled Joan, but she showed no hesitation. On the night of February 23rd, 1429, dressed as a man, armed with a sword she didn't know how to use, accompanied by 6 men she barely knew, she rode out of Vaucouleurs into the dangerous darkness. Behind her lay everything she had known: family, home, the familiar rhythms of village life. Ahead lay either glory or destruction, triumph or the stake. Her companions on this journey would later testify to her extraordinary presence during those 11 nights of travel. She insisted they stop at every church they passed so she could hear Mass, despite the danger of delay. She showed no fear when they had to ford icy rivers or when they heard Burgundian patrols nearby. She slept on the ground without complaint, maintaining perfect propriety despite being the only woman among 6 men. Jean de Metz, riding beside her through those long dark nights, asked her repeatedly about her voices, trying to understand what drove her. Her answers were always the same. The voices were real. They came from God, and she must obey them regardless of the cost. When he asked if she was afraid of being captured or killed, she replied that she feared nothing except treachery. As they travelled deeper into the Dauphin's territory, the landscape changed from the war-torn frontiers to regions that still maintained some semblance of normal life. They passed through villages preparing for spring planting, market towns conducting business, churches where life's rituals of baptism, marriage, and burial continued despite the kingdom's crisis. It was a France that still functioned, still hoped, still needed saving. On March 4th, they stopped at the town of Fierbois, where Joan insisted on visiting the Chapel of St. Catherine. This ancient sanctuary, dedicated to one of her voices, contained a famous collection of swords left by knights as votive offerings. Joan prayed there for hours while her companions grew increasingly nervous about the delay, but she emerged with renewed certainty and a specific prophecy. Behind the altar of this chapel lay an ancient sword marked with 5 crosses. When she needed a weapon, this sword would be retrieved for her. 2 days later, on March the 6th, 1429, the travel-worn party reached Chinon. The great castle, perched on its limestone cliff above the Vienne River, was one of the Dauphin's principal residences, a sprawling complex of towers, halls, and courtyards that housed not just the prince but his entire nomadic court. Somewhere within those walls was Charles, the man Joan had travelled so far to see, the doubtful prince she was commanded to transform into a king. Joan sent a message announcing her arrival and requesting an audience. Then she waited. The court erupted in debate. Some, like Charles's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, argued for receiving this girl, who claimed divine guidance. Others, like the powerful Georges de la Trémoille, warned against the embarrassment of entertaining a deluded peasant. Charles himself, perpetually indecisive, wavered between curiosity and caution. For 2 days, Joan waited at an inn in the town below the castle. Her voices reassured her. She would see the Dauphin. She would recognize him. She would convince him. But they also warned her that many at court would oppose her, that she would face examination and skepticism, that her path to Orléans would not be straight or easy. Finally, on the evening of March 8th, word came: the Dauphin would receive her. Joan climbed the steep path to the castle, entered through gates guarded by men-at-arms, who stared at this strange figure. A girl dressed as a boy, a peasant approaching a prince, a nobody claiming to be somebody. She was escorted through corridors lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on stone walls, past tapestries, depicting ancient victories, toward the great hall where 300 members of the court waited to witness this extraordinary meeting. What happened next would become one of the most famous scenes in French history, retold in countless paintings, plays, and poems. It would be the moment when the impossible became possible, when divine providence and human history intersected in a way that defied rational explanation. Joan was about to meet her king, though he didn't know it yet, and in recognizing him, she would begin the process of making him recognize himself. The great hall of Chinon Castle blazed with light on the evening of March 8th, 1429. 50 torches burned in iron sconces along the stone walls, their flames reflected in the armour of guards, the jewels of courtiers, the golden thread of tapestries depicting the victories of Charlemagne. 300 members of the Dauphin's court had assembled to witness what most expected would be either a brief entertainment or a terrible embarrassment. They stood in clusters, whispering behind raised hands, their silk garments rustling like autumn leaves as they jockeyed for better positions to view the coming spectacle. Charles, the man who should have been King Charles VII of France, but remained merely the Dauphin, the Dolphin, the heir in waiting, had orchestrated an elaborate deception. He stood not on the throne, but among a group of courtiers near one of the great fireplaces, dressed deliberately in simple clothing that gave no indication of his rank. In his place, wearing royal robes and seated on the throne, was Louis de Bourbon, Count of Clermont, a man who looked far more regal than Charles ever had. This substitution was more than a test, it was a reflection of Charles's deep insecurity about his own legitimacy. At 26, he was physically unimpressive, thin, knock-kneed, with a long nose and small worried eyes that gave him a permanently anxious expression. Years of doubt about his parentage, years of military defeats, years of watching his kingdom shrink like ice in spring had marked him. If this peasant girl truly had divine sight, she would find him regardless of his disguise. If she was a fraud, she would be exposed immediately and sent away. The great doors opened. Joan entered. She was smaller than most had expected, barely 5 feet tall, her hair cropped short like a boy's, wearing a black doublet and hose that had accumulated the dust of 11 days' travel. She should have been overwhelmed by the grandeur of the scene. A peasant girl who had never been inside anything grander than a parish church, suddenly confronted with the architectural embodiment of royal power. The vaulted ceiling soared 60 feet overhead. The walls were hung with cloth of gold. The assembled nobility wore fortunes in silk and velvet, their fingers heavy with rings, their necks circled with golden chains of office. But Joan walked forward without hesitation, her eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that made courtiers step back despite themselves. She ignored the Count of Clermont on the throne completely, didn't even glance in his direction. Instead, she moved through the crowd like a ship through water, courtiers parting before her, until she stopped directly in front of Charles. For a moment, sovereign and subject regarded each other in silence. Then Joan dropped to her knees, embraced Charles's legs in the gesture of feudal submission, and spoke words that would echo through French history. "Most noble Lord Dauphin, I am Joan the Maid, sent by God to help you and your kingdom. The King of Heaven speaks through me, and says you shall be anointed and crowned in the city of Reims, and you shall be the lieutenant of the King of Heaven, who is King of France." Charles attempted to maintain his deception. "You are mistaken," he said, gesturing toward the throne. "I am not the king. There he sits." Joan's response was immediate and unwavering. "In God's name, gentle prince, it is you and none other." The hall fell silent. The elaborate deception had failed, or rather, it had succeeded in proving something extraordinary. This girl, who had never seen the Dauphin, who had no way of knowing what he looked like, had identified him instantly among 300 people. Some courtiers would later claim they saw a nimbus of light around Joan as she knelt before Charles. Others said they heard music, though no musicians were playing. Most simply stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had witnessed. But Charles needed more than public recognition. He drew Joan aside into a window embrasure where they could speak privately. What passed between them in that alcove remained secret for the rest of both their lives. But Charles emerged transformed. The perpetually melancholy prince was, according to witnesses, radiant, joyful, as if he had seen an angel. Years later, during Joan's nullification trial, some witnesses suggested she had given Charles a sign regarding his legitimacy. The secret that tormented Charles, the possibility that he was not his father's son, but the product of his mother's numerous infidelities, had been answered. Joan had told him something, revealed something, confirmed something that only God could know. She had addressed his deepest fear and resolved it through divine authority, but the court was far from unanimous in accepting Jean. Georges de la Trémoille, the Grand Chamberlain and Charles' most powerful adviser, saw her as a threat to his influence. Archbishop Regnault de Chartres, Chancellor of France, was suspicious of anyone claiming direct divine revelation outside the Church's mediation. Many nobles were offended at the idea of a peasant, and a female peasant at that, presuming to lead armies and advise kings. The debate raged for days. Some argued that Joan should be sent away immediately. Her very presence was an embarrassment, a sign of how desperate the Dauphin had become. Others, led by Yolande of Aragon, Charles's formidable mother-in-law, argued that Joan should at least be examined. If she was sent by God, rejecting her would be blasphemy. If she was deluded or worse, an agent of the devil, that too needed to be determined. While the court debated, Joan was lodged in the Tour de Coudray, a tower in the castle where she could be watched but treated with respect. She was assigned a page, Louis de Coute, and a steward, Jean d'Aulon, who would remain with her throughout her brief military career. Noble ladies visited her, curious about this strange girl who dressed as a man and claimed to speak with saints. They found her courteous but unimpressed by their rank, treating duchesses and serving women with equal directness. Joan's behaviour during these weeks of waiting revealed her complex character. She was impatient with delay. Her voices told her she had a year, scarcely more, to complete her mission. Yet she understood the need to convince skeptics. She attended Mass daily, often multiple times, displaying a devotion that impressed even critical observers. She dictated letters, she could not write herself, to the English, warning them to leave France or face divine punishment. The letters were simultaneously naive in their expectation of compliance and sophisticated in their theological arguments. One letter, addressed to the Duke of Bedford, regent for the infant Henry VI, was particularly bold. "King of England, and you, Duke of Bedford, who call yourself regent of the kingdom of France. You, William de la Pole, Count of Suffolk, John, Lord Talbot, and you, Thomas. Lord Scales, who call yourselves lieutenants of the said Duke of Bedford, render account to the King of Heaven. Surrender to the maid who is sent here by God, the King of Heaven, the keys to all the good cities you have taken and violated in France." The English response was predictable. They dismissed her as a witch and threatened to burn her if captured. But the letter served its purpose in France, demonstrating Joan's absolute confidence in her mission and her willingness to challenge the greatest powers of her age. Finally, Charles decided on a course of action that was typically cautious. Joan would be sent to Poitiers, where a commission of theologians would examine her. If they found her orthodox and sincere, she could proceed. If not, she would be quietly dismissed. It was a way of shifting responsibility. If Joan succeeded, Charles could claim credit for recognizing divine intervention. If she failed or proved heretical, the theologians would bear the blame. The journey to Poitiers took 3 days through countryside, beginning to show the first signs of spring. Joan rode between guards who were unsure whether they were protecting or imprisoning her. She maintained her male dress, explaining to anyone who asked that it was necessary for her mission and commanded by her voices. The explanation satisfied no one, but her obvious piety and the growing reports of her prophetic knowledge kept critics at bay. Poitiers, in March 1429, was a city of lawyers and theologians, home to one of France's great universities, and its supreme judicial court, the Parlement, which had relocated there from Paris after the Burgundian takeover. The commission assembled to examine Joan included some of the finest theological minds in France: Regnault de Chartres, Archbishop of Reims; Pierre de Versailles, Bishop of Meaux; Jean Gerson, the renowned theologian who had written extensively on how to discern true from false revelations; and numerous doctors of theology and canon law. For 3 weeks, these learned men subjected Joan to intensive questioning. The transcripts of these examinations were later destroyed, probably deliberately, but witness testimonies allow us to reconstruct some of what occurred. The theologians questioned Joan about her voices. How did she know they were saints and not demons? Why would God choose an ignorant girl rather than working through his church? How could she, without theological training, distinguish divine revelation from delusion? Joan's answers displayed a remarkable combination of humility and certainty. When asked why God would choose her, she replied, "It pleased God to work through a simple maid to confound the king's enemies." When challenged about her lack of education, she said, "I know neither A nor B, but I come from the King of Heaven." When pressed about the nature of her voices, she insisted, "I believe as firmly as I believe in the Christian faith, and that God has redeemed us from the pains of hell, that this voice comes from God." The most challenging moment came when Guillaume Améry, a professor of theology, asked her a classic trap question: "Are you in God's grace?" The question was designed to be unanswerable. Church doctrine held that no one could be certain of being in God's grace. To claim certainty was the sin of presumption. To deny it was to admit sinfulness. Either answer would condemn her. Joan's response stunned the assembled theologians. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I were not in his grace." Pierre de Versailles would later say that the wisest theologian in the commission could not have answered better. Joan had somehow, without theological training, navigated one of the most complex questions in Christian doctrine. It was moments like these that began to convince the skeptics that, whatever the source of Joan's voices, she was not a fraud or a heretic. The commission also subjected Joan to physical examination, a standard procedure when dealing with claims of divine revelation. A woman's body was considered more susceptible to demonic possession than a man's, and virginity was seen as a sign of spiritual purity. Yolande of Aragon personally supervised this examination, along with several noble ladies. They confirmed that Joan was, in the language of the time, a true and intact maid, showing no signs of corruption or demonic interference. But the theologians wanted more than Joan's orthodoxy and virginity. They wanted a sign, some proof, that she was truly sent by God. Joan's response was characteristically direct. "I have not come to Poitiers to make signs, but send me to Orléans, and I will show you the signs for which I have been sent." This answer created a theological dilemma. If Joan was sent by God, demanding a sign showed lack of faith, but if she was deluded or fraudulent, sending her to Orléans would be catastrophic. The debate went on for days, with some commissioners arguing for caution and others for action. Finally, Jacques Gelou, Archbishop of Embrun, offered a solution drawn from Scripture. When God chooses the weak to confound the strong, he provides the means for their success. The Commission's final report, issued in April 1429, was cautiously favourable. They found in Joan nothing evil, but only good, humility, virginity, devotion, honesty, simplicity. They noted that she had correctly prophesied the Battle of the Herrings and demonstrated knowledge she couldn't have gained naturally. Most importantly, they argued that given the desperate state of the kingdom, Charles would be repelling the Holy Spirit if he rejected her without testing her claims. The recommendation was clear: let her go to Orléans. But even with theological approval, practical obstacles remained. Joan needed an army, supplies, and military commanders willing to follow her. The Dauphin's treasury was nearly empty, his best generals sceptical of taking orders from a teenage girl. Joan also needed proper equipment, armour, weapons, a banner that would identify her on the battlefield. The armour was commissioned from Tours, specially fitted to Joan's small frame. It was white armour, polished steel without ornamentation, functional rather than ceremonial. The cost was enormous, 100 livres tournois, but Yolande of Aragon paid for it, one of many instances where Charles' mother-in-law proved more decisive than Charles himself. For her sword, Joan made a specific request that again demonstrated her mysterious knowledge. She sent a messenger to the church of Sainte-Catherine de Fierbois, where she had stopped on her journey to Chinon. Behind the altar, she said, buried in the earth lay an ancient sword marked with 5 crosses. The clergy of Fierbois were sceptical, but searched where Joan indicated. They found the sword exactly as described, its blade still bright despite its age, the 5 crosses clearly visible on the hilt. The discovery of the sword created a sensation. How could Joan have known about a weapon buried in a church she had visited only once? Some said the sword had belonged to Charles Martel, who had defeated the Saracens in 732. Others claimed it was the blade of a Crusader knight. Joan herself would say only that St. Catherine had told her where to find it, and that it would serve her until her mission was complete. Even more important to Joan than her sword was her banner. She designed it herself, dictating precise instructions to Hove Poulnois, a Scottish painter living in Tours. The banner was white silk, fringed with silk, showing Christ in judgment holding the world, flanked by 2 angels. The words Jesus Maria were embroidered in gold thread, along with fleur-de-lis symbolising France. Joan would later say she loved her banner 40 times better than her sword because it allowed her to lead without killing. As April progressed, an army began to assemble at Blois, the staging point for the relief of Orléans. It was not the massive force Joan had hoped for, perhaps 4,000 men, rather than the 10,000 she had requested, but it included some of France's best commanders. Jean d'Alençon, the young duke whose father had died at Agincourt, volunteered to serve under John despite the irregularity of a peer of France following a peasant. Etienne de Vignoles, called La Hire, one of France's most feared warriors, agreed to join the expedition. Gilles de Rais, young, wealthy, and eager for glory, brought his own company of men-at-arms. But the most important recruit was Jean, Count of Dunois, the illegitimate half-brother of the Duke of Orléans, known as the Bastard of Orléans. He had been defending the besieged city for months, and his agreement to work with Joan was crucial. He rode to Blois to meet her, expecting to find either a deluded fanatic or a cunning fraud. Instead, he encountered something that changed his understanding of the possible. Dunois would later testify that from the moment he met Joan, the entire character of the war changed. Before her arrival, he said, 200 Englishmen could routinely defeat 500 or even 1,000 French soldiers. After Joan, 400 or 500 French could fight the entire English army. It was not that Joan was a brilliant tactician. She wasn't. Her military ideas were often simplistic, even reckless. But she possessed something that transcended strategy, absolute faith that God would give victory to France. Joan's impact on the ordinary soldiers was even more dramatic. These were men who had known nothing but defeat for years, who had come to believe that God favoured the English, that French arms were cursed. Joan told them that God was on their side, that victory was certain if they would only fight with courage and maintain their faith. She required them to confess before battle, expelled the camp prostitutes who traditionally followed armies and forbade looting and blasphemy. The army that assembled at Blois in late April 1429 was unlike any in recent French experience. The soldiers attended mass en masse, confessed their sins, and marched behind banners of saints, rather than nobles. They sang hymns as they moved through the countryside. Priests carrying consecrated hosts led the columns. It looked more like a religious procession than a military expedition, which was exactly what Joan intended. This was not merely a war between kingdoms, but a holy war for the salvation of France. On April 27th, 1429, this strange army set out from Blois toward Orléans. Joan rode at its head in her white armour, her banner carried before her by her squire, surrounded by priests chanting prayers. Behind her came supply wagons loaded with grain and gunpowder, herds of cattle for the besieged city, and thousands of soldiers who had rediscovered hope. The English forces besieging Orléans, when they learned of the approaching relief force, were divided in their response. Some commanders, like William Glasdale, who held Les Tourelles, the fortified gatehouse, controlling the bridge, dismissed Joan as a witch whose powers would fail against true Christians. Others, including John Talbot, the most experienced English commander, were troubled by reports of the transformation in French morale. The English had won their great victories through psychological dominance as much as military superiority. If the French no longer believed themselves defeated, the entire strategic situation could change. As Joan's army approached Orléans on the evening of April 28th, a crucial decision had to be made. The English controlled the western and southern approaches to the city with their fortified positions. The only safe route was from the east, along the north bank of the Loire, but this would require the army to cross the river upstream and then double back, a complex manoeuvre that would delay the relief of the city. Dunois, as the most experienced commander, had already made arrangements for boats to ferry the supplies and soldiers across the Loire east of the city. But when Joan learned of this plan, she exploded in anger. Her voices had told her to approach directly, to challenge the English positions, to demonstrate that God would protect the French army. The cautious, indirect approach was faithlessness, a failure to trust in divine providence. The argument between Joan and Dunois would establish a pattern that would continue throughout her military career. The professional soldiers wanted to use traditional tactics to avoid unnecessary risks, to preserve their forces. Joan wanted to attack immediately and directly, trusting in God to provide victory. She had no patience for siegecraft, no interest in elaborate manoeuvres, no understanding of logistics. She knew only that her voices promised victory if she acted with faith and courage. On this occasion, Dunois prevailed, partly because the wind was blowing from the wrong direction to allow the boats to cross where Joan wanted. But then, as witnesses would later testify, something extraordinary happened. As soon as the army began following Dunois's plan, the wind changed direction completely, allowing the boats to sail exactly where Joan had originally intended. Dunois would later say, this was the moment he became convinced Joan was sent by God. As darkness fell on April 28th, Joan entered Orléans through the Burgundy Gate, riding a white horse, her armour gleaming in the light of torches held by citizens who had come out to greet their deliverer. The crowd pressed so close that one of the torches set her banner on fire. Joan calmly extinguished it, displaying a horsemanship that surprised those who knew she had only learned to ride months before. The people of Orléans, who had endured 6 months of siege, who had seen their supplies dwindle and their walls crumble under English bombardment, looked at this teenage girl as if she were an angel descended from heaven. They reached out to touch her armour, her horse, her banner. They wept and called out blessings. Children ran alongside her horse, singing hymns. Joan rode through the crowd to the church of Sainte-Croix, where she dismounted and prayed while the bells rang out across the city. Then she was taken to the house of Jacques Boucher, the treasurer of Orléans, where she would stay during the coming battle. She shared a bed with Charlotte, Jacques' 9-year-old daughter, maintaining the propriety that was essential to her reputation. That night, as Joan slept in a proper bed for the first time in months, the English in their fortifications around the city tried to understand what had just happened. A relief force had entered Orléans, something they had prevented for 6 months. The French were singing and celebrating rather than cowering behind their walls. And at the centre of it all was a teenage girl who claimed God had sent her to destroy them. Some English soldiers, particularly those from the common ranks, were genuinely frightened. They had heard rumours of Joan's prophecies, her discovery of the hidden sword, her ability to recognise the Dauphin. In an age when everyone believed in the supernatural, the possibility that she might indeed have divine powers was terrifying. The English had justified their conquest of France by claiming God favoured their cause. What if they were wrong? But the English commanders, particularly William Glasdale at Les Tourelles and William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, maintained their confidence. They had defeated every French army sent against them for decades. They held fortified positions with veteran troops. They had cannons, expert archers, and the knowledge of siege warfare gained from a century of combat. Whatever Joan of Arc might be, witch, prophet, or deluded peasant, she was about to face the reality of medieval warfare, and in that reality, the English had always won. The morning of April 29th, 1429, dawned grey and misty over Orléans, the Loire flowing like molten silver beneath the broken arches of the bridge. Joan rose before dawn, as was her custom, to hear Mass at the cathedral. The church was packed with citizens who had come to glimpse their Saviour, to touch her if possible, to reassure themselves that her arrival had not been a dream. After Mass, Joan climbed the walls to survey the English positions. What she saw would have discouraged a professional soldier. The English had built a ring of fortified positions around the city, each one a small wooden fortress called a boulevard, protected by ditches, palisades, and earthworks. The strongest positions were to the south, Les Tourelles, the twin-towered gatehouse that controlled the bridge, and Les Augustins, a fortified monastery that protected Les Tourelles' flank. To the west lay more boulevards, controlling the Paris road. To the north and east, the positions were weaker but still formidable. The English strategy was classically methodical. They didn't need to assault Orléans' massive walls. They could simply starve the city into submission, tightening their grip month by month until hunger and disease forced surrender. It was a strategy that had worked at Rouen, at Meaux, at every major siege of the war. Time was on their side, but Joan had no intention of playing by conventional rules. That very morning, she dictated another letter to the English commanders, having it shot over the walls, attached to an arrow. You, men of England, who have no right to this kingdom of France, the King of Heaven orders and notifies you through me, Joan the Maid, to leave your fortresses and go back to your own country, or I will produce a clash of arms to be eternally remembered. And this is the third and last time I write to you. I shall not write any more. The English response was immediate and crude. They shouted from their fortifications that Joan was a cowgirl and a whore, that they would burn her when they caught her. William Glasdale, commanding Les Tourelles, was particularly vitriolic, his insults carrying across the water to where Joan stood on the city walls. She wept at his words, not from fear, but from sorrow that he was damning his soul. Then, recovering her composure, she shouted back, "You lie! And despite you soon you will depart from here, but you will not see it, for you will be dead." The prediction would prove prophetically accurate, but for now it only provoked more English mockery. They had heard such threats before, from desperate French commanders. Words didn't win battles, arrows and swords did. The first days after Joan's arrival were frustrating for everyone involved. Dunois and the other captains wanted to wait for reinforcements before attempting any serious action. They had managed to get supplies into the city, which could now withstand a longer siege. Why risk everything on a premature attack? Joan, however, grew increasingly agitated. Her voices were urgent. She had not come to Orléans to wait but to fight. The tension came to a head on May 1st, when Dunois left for Blois to hurry the reinforcements. Joan felt betrayed, abandoned by the very man who should be helping her fulfill her mission. She spent the day in prayer, but also rode around the walls in full view of the English, studying their positions with an intensity that made even experienced soldiers uncomfortable. She was learning, absorbing in days what most commanders took years to understand. On May 3rd, while Joan was resting in the afternoon, she often took brief naps, a habit from her peasant upbringing. Her voices suddenly spoke with terrible urgency. She leapt from her bed, calling for her squire Jean d'Aulon to help her into her armour. "My counsel tells me to go against the English," she declared, "but I don't know whether against their fortifications or against Glassdale, who would prevent provisions from entering." As d'Aulon was still fastening her armour, sounds of battle erupted from the eastern side of the city. A group of French soldiers, acting without orders, had launched an attack on the English boulevard of Saint-Lô. It was exactly the kind of undisciplined action that usually ended in disaster, a few hundred men attacking a fortified position defended by 300 English soldiers. Joan rode through the streets like a whirlwind, her banner streaming behind her, gathering soldiers as she went. Citizens ran from their houses to see her pass, many following on foot. She burst through the Burgundy gate to find the French attack faltering, men beginning to flee as English arrows found their marks. The sight of retreat always enraged Joan. She spurred her horse forward, directly into the arrow storm, her banner raised high. "In the name of God, forward! They are ours!" The effect was instantaneous. The fleeing soldiers turned back. Fresh troops poured from the city. The attack that had been failing suddenly succeeded. Within an hour, Saint-Lô was in French hands. The English garrison was dead or captured. The fortification burned. It was the first French victory in open battle in living memory. But as the smoke cleared and the adrenaline faded, Joan witnessed the reality of medieval warfare. The ground was littered with bodies, English and French tangled together in death. The wounded screamed for water or mercy. English prisoners were being stripped and bound, knowing they faced ransom if noble, slavery or death if common. Joan found some French soldiers preparing to execute English prisoners who had taken refuge in the chapel, having hastily put on priests' robes in a desperate attempt to claim sanctuary. Joan intervened, placing herself between the soldiers and their victims. These men were her enemies, but they were also Christians with souls that needed saving. She insisted they be taken prisoner rather than killed, personally guaranteeing their safety. Then, in an act that amazed both French and English witnesses, she knelt beside a dying English soldier, cradling his head and helping him make his final confession. The capture of Saint-Lô changed everything. For the first time since Agincourt, French forces had defeated an English fortified position in direct assault. The psychological impact was enormous. Inside Orléans, church bells rang in celebration. Citizens who had hidden their valuables began to bring them out, believing for the first time that their city might actually be saved. Among the English, the effect was equally profound, but opposite. They had lost boulevards before to surprise attacks or overwhelming numbers, but this was different. The French had attacked with inferior numbers against a prepared position and won. Even more disturbing were reports from survivors about Joan's presence on the battlefield. She had ridden through arrows untouched, her banner seeming to glow in the smoke. Some soldiers swore they had seen St. Michael himself fighting beside her. May 4th was Ascension Day, a holy day when Christian armies traditionally observed a truce. Joan spent the day in prayer and confession, but also in preparation. She had her armour repaired and her sword sharpened. Most importantly, she told her confessor, Jean Pasquerel, to stay close to her in the coming battle. "Tomorrow I shall have much to do, more than I ever had. Tomorrow blood'll flow from my body above my breast." The prophecy of her wounding spread through the French camp, reaching even the English lines. It was another of Joan's mysterious predictions, specific and verifiable. If she was wounded above the breast but survived, it would be further proof of her divine mission. If she died, the French cause would die with her. May 5th saw intense negotiations. The French War Council met to discuss strategy. The conservative faction, led by Raoul de Gaucourt, the governor of Orléans, wanted to wait for more reinforcements to attack the weaker English positions on the west bank first. Joan wanted to attack Les Tourelles immediately, striking at the English strength. The argument grew heated, with Joan accusing the captains of cowardice and they questioning her understanding of warfare. Finally, a compromise was reached. They would attack the English positions on the south bank, but beginning with Les Augustins, the fortified monastery that protected Les Tourelles' flank. If that fell, they could consider attacking Les Tourelles itself. It was a reasonable plan that satisfied no one completely, which in politics often means it's the right decision. On the morning of May 6th, the French army assembled. Joan heard Mass at dawn, confessed, and received communion. Then she led the army out through the Burgundy Gate, crossing to the south bank of the Loire by boat, at a point upstream from the English positions. The plan was to attack Les Augustins from the landward side, while other forces demonstrated against the western boulevards to prevent English reinforcement. The battle for Les Augustins was fierce but brief. The English garrison, perhaps 200 men, fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant death or capture. But they were overwhelmed by superior numbers, and more importantly, by French confidence. Joan was everywhere during the battle, directing attacks, rallying waverers, always visible with her white armour and distinctive banner. As Les Augustins fell, with the monastery buildings burning and English soldiers fleeing toward Les Tourelles, Dunois wanted to pause, to consolidate the victory and prepare for the next day's battle. But Joan had seen something the professional soldiers missed. The English fleeing from Les Augustins had left the outer works of Les Tourelles momentarily disorganised. The drawbridge between the two positions was crowded with retreating soldiers. The moment of vulnerability would pass quickly, but it was there. "Press on," Joan commanded. "God has delivered them into our hands." The French surged forward before Dunois could stop them, Joan at their head. They overran the outer earthworks of Les Tourelles, the boulevard that protected the gatehouse itself. The English, under Glasdale's direct command, barely managed to raise the drawbridge in time, retreating into the twin towers of Les Tourelles itself. But they had lost the outer defences that made the position nearly impregnable. Night was falling. The captains wanted to withdraw, to rest and attack fresh in the morning. But Joan insisted they maintain a presence in the captured boulevard. Soldiers worked through the night, bringing up supplies, positioning cannons, preparing for the morning's assault. Joan herself didn't sleep, moving among the soldiers, encouraging them, praying with them, promising victory when dawn came. Inside Les Tourelles, William Glasdale and his garrison of perhaps 400 men prepared for what they knew would be the decisive battle. Glasdale was a veteran of dozens of fights, a man who had risen from minor gentry to command through courage and skill. He had personally insulted Joan from the walls, called her a witch and whore. Now he would face her in battle, and despite his bravado, he must have felt the hand of fate closing around him. The night was filled with strange sounds and sights. French soldiers later swore they saw lights moving in the sky above Les Tourelles, like stars descending to earth. English sentries reported hearing voices speaking in no language they recognised. Both sides took these as omens, though they interpreted them differently. May 7th dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for killing. Joan rose before dawn, as always, to prepare for what she knew would be the crucial day. As her squire helped her into her armour, she was calmer than she had been in weeks. Her voices had spoken clearly. Today, Les Tourelles would fall, but she would be wounded. The wound would not be mortal. She must not fear but press on when others would retreat. The French assembled for the assault, men-at-arms in plate armour carrying ladders, crossbowmen to provide covering fire, common soldiers with picks and hammers to undermine the walls if possible. The Orléans militia had turned out in force, citizens fighting for their own freedom. Priests moved through the ranks, giving absolution, blessing weapons, reminding the soldiers they fought for God and France. The assault began at dawn. The French attacked from the captured boulevard, while ships filled with soldiers attacked from the riverside. Les Tourelles was like an island of stone and timber rising from the Loire, connected to the south bank by the drawbridge the English had raised and partially destroyed. The only way to take it was by direct assault, climbing ladders under a rain of arrows, crossbow bolts, stones, and burning oil. The first assault failed. The second failed. Men fell from ladders, pierced by arrows, or pushed off by English defenders. The moat around Les Tourelles filled with French dead and wounded, but Joan kept driving them forward, always at the front, her banner a rallying point in the smoke and chaos. Around noon, during the fourth or fifth assault, accounts vary in the confusion, Joan was placing a ladder against the wall when an English crossbow bolt struck her between the neck and shoulder, exactly where she had predicted. The bolt went deep, piercing her light armour, protruding from her back. She fell, and for a moment both armies paused, watching to see if the maid was dead. English soldiers cheered. French soldiers began to waver. The wound was clearly serious, blood was flowing freely, and Joan was crying from pain and shock. Some soldiers tried to treat the wound with charms and incantations, but Joan refused, saying she would rather die than use witchcraft. She allowed them to pack the wound with olive oil and lard, then retired to a nearby vineyard to rest and pray. Dunois and the other captains, seeing Joan wounded and the soldiers demoralized, prepared to sound retreat. They had taken Les Augustins and the boulevard. That was enough for one day. They could try again tomorrow, or perhaps negotiate now from a position of strength. It was late afternoon. The soldiers were exhausted, and without Joan to lead them, another assault would certainly fail. But as the trumpets were about to sound retreat, Joan returned. She had pulled the crossbow bolt out herself, an act of incredible courage, given the pain and the risk of increased bleeding. Her wound had been bandaged, but blood was seeping through her armour. She could barely stand, yet she demanded her horse and her banner. "Wait," she told Dunois. "Eat and drink. Rest a little. When you see my banner touch the wall, the place is yours." She rode forward slowly, painfully, her banner in her hand. The French soldiers, who had been preparing to retreat, saw her advancing alone toward Les Tourelles. Then, as if released from a spell, they surged forward with her. This was not an ordered military advance, but something more primal. Thousands of men following a wounded teenage girl because they believed God was with her. Joan reached the edge of the moat, her banner extended toward the walls. At that moment, according to multiple witnesses, her banner seemed to touch the fortress walls, though the distance should have made this impossible. Whether optical illusion, miracle, or poetic truth, the effect was explosive. The French attacked with renewed fury, scaling ladders faster than the exhausted English could push them off. At the same moment, the militia of Orléans had performed their own miracle. Working from the city side, they had managed to lay planks across the broken arches of the bridge, creating a precarious pathway to attack Les Tourelles from the north. Citizens crossed this improvised bridge, joining the assault from an unexpected direction. William Glasdale, seeing his position crumbling, tried to retreat across the drawbridge to the boulevard. But the French had brought up cannons and incendiaries. As Glasdale and his armoured companions crossed, the drawbridge, weakened by fire and bombardment, collapsed. Glasdale and several other knights, weighted down by their armour, fell into the Loire and drowned. Joan, watching from the bank, wept for Glasdale's soul. This was the man who had called her a whore, who had promised to burn her, who had blasphemed against her mission. Yet she mourned his damnation more than she celebrated his death. She had warned him this would happen, had begged him to surrender and save his soul. Now he was beyond salvation, and even in victory, this grieved her. As sunset approached, Les Tourelles was in French hands. The surviving English surrendered, knowing they would be well treated. Joan's reputation for protecting prisoners was already established. The French had captured the strongest English position, the key to the siege, in a single day's fighting. It was not just a tactical victory, but a strategic revolution. The siege of Orleans was effectively over. That night, the remaining English forces held a council of war. They still had several strong positions, enough men to continue the siege if they chose. But something had broken in their spirit. The men were terrified of Joan, convinced she was either a witch or a saint, either way possessing supernatural powers they couldn't defeat. Even the commanders, trying to maintain rationality, couldn't explain what had happened. How had starving, demoralized French forces suddenly become invincible? How had a teenage girl survived a wound that should have incapacitated her and led a successful assault? On the morning of May 8th, a Sunday, the English army formed up in battle array outside their remaining fortifications. It was a challenge to open battle, army against army, the kind of fight they had always won. But Joan, despite her eagerness for combat, recognized this was different. It was Sunday, the Lord's Day. Her voices told her not to attack, but to let them go if they chose. For an hour, the two armies faced each other across the fields outside Orleans. The English waited for the French attack that would let them salvage some honour from defeat. The French waited for Joan's command. She stood in front of her army, her wounds still painful, but her spirit undaunted, and did something unprecedented in medieval warfare. She had an altar erected and mass celebrated on the battlefield. As the priest elevated the host, as thousands of French soldiers knelt in prayer, the English broke. They simply turned and marched away, abandoning their fortifications, their cannons, their supplies, everything that would slow their retreat. The siege that had lasted 7 months, that was supposed to end French resistance forever, was over in 7 days. The people of Orleans exploded in celebration. Church bells rang continuously. Citizens danced in the streets. Bonfires burned all night as people sang hymns of thanksgiving. Joan was carried through the city on the shoulders of soldiers, her banner waving above the crowd, people reaching out to touch her armour as if it were a holy relic. But Joan herself, while accepting the gratitude with grace, seemed almost melancholy in victory. When asked why she wasn't more joyful, she replied that this was only the beginning. She still had to see the Dauphin crowned at Reims, still had to drive the English from France, still had to complete the mission her voices had given her, and always, like a shadow at the feast, was the knowledge that she had a year, scarcely more, before her capture. The news of Orleans' liberation spread across France like wildfire. In English-held territories, French civilians began to hope again. In the Dauphin's territories, volunteers flooded to join the army. In Burgundy, Duke Philip the Good began to reconsider his English alliance. The girl who had been mocked as a deluded peasant was now the Maid of Orleans, the saviour of France, living proof that God had not abandoned the kingdom. But in the English camp, as they retreated toward their strongholds in Normandy, a different narrative was forming. Joan was a witch who had used sorcery to defeat them. She had made a pact with the devil, selling her soul for military victory. This explanation preserved English honour. They hadn't been defeated by a teenage girl, but by supernatural evil. It was a narrative that would pursue Joan for the rest of her short life, a shadow that would eventually consume her in flames. For now, though, in May 1429, Joan stood triumphant. She had done what she promised, what everyone said was impossible. She had lifted the siege of Orleans. The English were retreating for the first time in living memory. The Dauphin's cause, which had seemed hopeless just weeks before, now blazed with possibility. The transformation was not just military, but spiritual. The French had rediscovered their courage, their faith, their belief in their own cause. The English had lost their aura of invincibility. The war that had seemed over was suddenly dramatically alive again. And at the centre of it all was an 18-year-old girl who heard voices, who had been wounded exactly as she predicted, who wept for her enemies even as she defeated them. As Joan left Orleans on May 10th to report to the Dauphin, the crowds that lined her route didn't see her as just a military commander. They saw her as something more: prophet, saint, saviour. She had become a living symbol of divine intervention, proof that God still cared for France. It was a dangerous thing to become, this mixture of the sacred and political. It would bring her to heights of glory and depths of suffering that she could not yet imagine. But for this moment, as she rode through the French countryside, in the spring sunshine, her banner rippling in the wind, her wound healing cleanly, surrounded by soldiers who would follow her anywhere, Joan of Arc was exactly what her voices had promised she would be: the virgin who would save France. The impossible had become reality. The kingdom that had been dying was suddenly miraculously being reborn. The court at Loches, where Charles received Joan on May 11th, 1429, was a study in contrasts. The great hall buzzed with excitement over the victory at Orléans. Courtiers who had mocked Joan weeks before, now eager to associate themselves with her triumph. Yet beneath the celebration lay deep currents of anxiety and division. What should be done with this miraculous victory? How far should they trust this peasant girl who had delivered it? Joan found Charles in his private chambers, surrounded by his counsellors. She knelt before him, embracing his knees in her customary gesture of fealty, but her words were anything but submissive. "Noble Dauphin, do not hold such lengthy and wordy counsels, but come to Reims to receive your worthy crown." Georges de la Trémoille, the Grand Chamberlain whose bulk matched his influence, immediately objected. Reims lay deep in enemy territory, over 200 miles northeast through lands controlled by Burgundians and English. To attempt such a journey would be madness. Better to consolidate their gains, perhaps retake Normandy while the English were demoralised. Archbishop Regnault de Chartres agreed. As Archbishop of Reims, he of all people wanted to see Charles crowned in his cathedral, but not at the cost of losing everything on a reckless adventure. They should negotiate from their new position of strength, perhaps arrange a truce that would recognise Charles as King of southern France. Joan's response revealed her growing frustration with political caution. "I shall last a year, scarcely more. We must think to do much good work in that year, for I have much to do." The specificity of her timeline disturbed even her supporters. How did she know she had only a year? What did her voices tell her that she wasn't sharing? The debate continued for days. Charles, perpetually indecisive, wavered between options. But while the politicians talked, something extraordinary was happening throughout France. The victory at Orléans had created a psychological revolution. Men who had hidden in their villages for years emerged to join the army. Towns that had remained neutral declared for Charles. Even in English-occupied territories, French civilians began acts of resistance that would have been unthinkable weeks before. The army that assembled at Orléans in early June was unlike anything France had fielded in decades. Perhaps 12,000 men gathered, including the greatest nobles still loyal to Charles. The Duke of Alençon, young and eager for glory, was given nominal command, though everyone understood that Joan was the true leader. La Hire brought his routiers, rough men who had lived by plunder, but now found themselves part of something greater. Gilles de Rais, wealthy and ambitious, equipped an entire company at his own expense. Joan transformed this army as she had transformed the force at Orléans. She expelled the camp followers, required confession before battle, and forbade looting. She had priests accompany each unit, saying mass daily and leading prayers morning and evening. Veterans who had spent their lives in brutal warfare found themselves singing hymns as they marched. It should have been absurd, but somehow it worked. The army that had assembled as a collection of individual war bands became a unified force with a shared purpose. The strategic situation in June 1429 required careful consideration. The English still held a string of fortified towns along the Loire River: Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. These positions threatened Orléans from upriver and would have to be neutralised before any march to Reims could be contemplated. Moreover, somewhere in the region was an English field army, under John Talbot and John Fastolf, two of England's most experienced commanders, with perhaps 5,000 men. The first target was Jargeau, 12 miles east of Orléans, where the Earl of Suffolk had taken refuge with perhaps 700 men after the siege's collapse. The town was well fortified with stone walls and towers surrounded by a moat. Suffolk was an experienced commander who had spent the time since May strengthening his defences and appealing for relief. On June 11th, the French army appeared before Jargeau's walls. The Duke of Alençon, as nominal commander, wanted to begin with a formal siege, bringing up artillery to breach the walls before any assault. But Joan had no patience for such delays. "Forward, gentle Duke," she told Alençon. "Do not doubt. This is the hour when it pleases God. Work, and God will work." The assault began immediately, with Joan in the thick of the action. As she was setting a scaling ladder against the walls, Alençon warned her to move, having seen a defender preparing to drop a large stone. Joan stepped aside just as the stone crashed where she'd been standing, splitting in pieces that struck her helmet but did her no harm. To the superstitious soldiers, it was another sign of divine protection. Suffolk, seeing his walls about to be overrun, tried to negotiate surrender. In the confusion of battle, he attempted to yield to a French squire, wanting to avoid the dishonour of surrendering to commoners. But the situation was beyond such niceties. The French poured over the walls, and Suffolk was taken prisoner along with his surviving men. The entire siege had lasted just one day. At Jargeau, Joan demonstrated a quality that would characterise her entire campaign: speed. Medieval warfare was typically deliberate, even leisurely. Armies moved slowly, sieges lasted months, commanders negotiated endlessly. Joan operated at a pace that left both enemies and allies breathless. She had a year, scarcely more, and she intended to use every day. From Jargeau, the army wheeled west toward Meung-sur-Loire, where a strong garrison held a fortified bridge over the Loire. Joan didn't even attempt to take the town itself, instead isolating the garrison and capturing the bridge on June 15th after a brief but fierce fight. The English garrison retreated into the town's keep, effectively neutralised. The next day, June 16th, the French appeared before Beaugency, the last English stronghold on the Loire between Orléans and the west. The garrison commander, Matthew Gouffe, was a Welsh professional who had no illusions about his situation. He had perhaps 600 men against an army of thousands, and no relief was coming. He opened negotiations immediately. The parley at Beaugency revealed the transformation in power dynamics since Orléans. Before Joan's arrival, English garrisons had dictated terms, demanding safe passage with their weapons, horses, and even their plunder. Now Gough was reduced to begging for his men's lives. The French agreed to let the garrison depart, but they had to leave everything behind: weapons, horses, even their valuable prisoners. They could take only the clothes on their backs and small sticks to mark them as defeated men under safe conduct. As the English filed out of Beaugency on June 17th, many French soldiers wanted to attack them despite the safe conduct, to take revenge for years of humiliation. Joan personally intervened, placing herself between the departing English and her own men. A promise was sacred, even to enemies. The English must be allowed to leave unmolested. It was another example of Joan's unusual approach to warfare, fierce in battle, but merciful in victory. But even as Beaugency was falling, the English field army under Talbot and Fastolf was approaching. They had gathered every available soldier from Normandy and the Paris region, perhaps 5,000 men, including the feared English longbowmen who had dominated battlefields for a century. Their plan was to relieve Beaugency, but they arrived too late. The town had already surrendered. The two armies spent the night of June 17th within a few miles of each other, both sides knowing that the next day would bring the first major field battle since Joan's arrival. For the English, it was a chance to restore their reputation, to prove that whatever had happened at Orléans was a fluke. For the French, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that their transformation was real. that they could defeat the English, not just in sieges but in open battle. The Battle of Patay on June 18th, 1429, would prove to be one of the most decisive engagements of the 100 Years' War, though it lasted barely an hour. The English, following their traditional tactics, chose a defensive position on a low ridge near the village of Patay, about 18 miles north of Orleans. They deployed in their classic formation: dismounted men-at-arms in the centre, longbowmen on the flanks, protected by sharpened stakes driven into the ground. This formation had been invincible at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. The longbowmen would devastate attacking cavalry with their arrows, which could penetrate armour at 200 yards. Any enemy who survived the arrow storm would be exhausted and disorganised when they reached the English line, easy prey for the men-at-arms. It was a tactical system that had never failed. But at Patay, everything went wrong for the English. As they were setting up their position, a stag broke from the woods and ran through their lines. The English soldiers, many of them hunters in civilian life, couldn't resist shouting at the sight. The French vanguard, led by La Hire and including about 1,500 cavalry, heard the shouts and realised exactly where the English were. La Hire didn't wait for the main army. He didn't wait for orders. He simply charged, catching the English before their archers had fully deployed their stakes. The French cavalry, which had been slaughtered so many times by English arrows, finally had their revenge. They rode down the archers before they could loose more than a few volleys, turning what should have been an organised battle into a chaotic melee. Joan and the main army were still coming up when the battle was essentially over. Talbot fought bravely, but was captured along with dozens of other English nobles. Fastolf fled with the remnants of the army, an action that would destroy his reputation, despite being the only sensible option. English casualties were catastrophic, over 2,000 dead against fewer than 100 French losses. The psychological impact of Patay was even greater than its military significance. The English longbowmen, the terror weapon that had dominated battlefields for a century, had been defeated in open battle. The myth of English invincibility, already cracked at Orleans, shattered completely. From this point forward, the English would fight defensively, holding fortified positions, but rarely risking field battles. Joan's reaction to the victory was characteristic. While the French celebrated and pillaged the English dead, she found an English soldier dying in agony, his skull crushed. She dismounted, cradled his head in her lap, and called for a priest to hear his confession. When someone suggested she should rejoice in the enemy's destruction, she replied that she took no joy in Christian blood being spilled. She was fighting to free France, not to kill Englishmen. With the Loire cleared and the English field army destroyed, the road to Reims lay open. But Charles still hesitated. The journey would take the army through territory that hadn't seen a French royal presence in decades. Towns like Auxerre, Troyes, and Chalon were officially Burgundian, and their loyalty was uncertain. If even one major town resisted, the army could be trapped deep in enemy territory. Joan's frustration with the delays reached a breaking point. On June 24th, she dictated a letter to the citizens of Tournai. The maid lets you know that in 8 days she has chased the English out of all the places they held on the Loire River, by assault or otherwise, where many were killed and captured, and she has defeated them in battle. Know that the Earl of Suffolk, his brother, the Lord Talbot, the Lord Scales, and Lord John Fastolf, with many other knights and captains, have been captured, and the Earl of Suffolk's brother and Glassdale are dead. Hold yourselves ready to come to the anointing of the gentle King Charles at Reims, where we shall be soon. The letter was more than communication, it was prophecy. Joan was declaring what would happen before it had been decided, forcing Charles's hand through sheer will. She had learned that waiting for royal decisions meant waiting forever. Better to act and let the politicians catch up. Finally, at the end of June, Charles agreed to march to Reims. The army that departed from Gien on June 29th, 1429, was the largest France had fielded in a generation. Perhaps 12,000 soldiers, plus thousands more civilians, who joined what was becoming as much pilgrimage as military campaign. Joan rode at the head, her banner carried before her, priests singing the Veni Creator Spiritus. The first test came at Auxerre, a strongly fortified city that controlled a crucial crossing of the Yonne River. The city fathers faced an impossible choice. They were officially Burgundian, but here was a French army led by the miraculous Maid of Orleans. They negotiated frantically, finally agreeing to remain neutral. They wouldn't open their gates, but they would supply food and wouldn't oppose the army's passage. Joan wanted to attack Auxerre, to punish their refusal to acknowledge Charles as king, but Alençon and the other commanders convinced her that bypassing the city was wiser. They had momentum. A lengthy siege would lose it. Joan agreed reluctantly, but she never forgot what she saw as Auxerre's betrayal. The pattern repeated at town after town. Local authorities, faced with Joan's army and unsure which way the political wind was blowing, chose neutrality or nominal submission. They provided supplies, allowed the army to pass, but maintained plausible deniability in case the English returned. It was frustrating for Joan, who wanted clear declarations of loyalty, but it was enough to keep the army moving. The crucial test came at Troyes on July 5th. This was where the infamous treaty had been signed in 1420, disinheriting Charles and giving France to England. The city had strong walls, a Burgundian garrison, and a large population that had prospered under English rule. If Troyes resisted, the march to Reims would likely fail. Charles's councillors, particularly Archbishop Regnault, argued for negotiation. They spent days in futile talks while the army's supplies dwindled and morale began to flag. Joan, increasingly impatient, finally took matters into her own hands. She ordered the army to prepare for assault, having bundles of wood gathered to fill the moat, positioning artillery to breach the walls. The sight of Joan directing siege preparations, her banner visible on the front lines, caused panic within Troyes. Citizens who had been confident in their walls suddenly remembered what had happened at Orléans and Jargeau. On July 9th, after Joan had worked through the night, preparing the assault that would begin at dawn, the city fathers capitulated. They would open their gates and acknowledge Charles as king. The surrender of Troyes was the turning point. If this symbolic city, where France had been given to England, could return to French allegiance, anything was possible. The road to Reims, both literal and metaphorical, lay open. On July 16th, 1429, Charles and his army reached Chalon-sur-Marne, just 30 miles from Reims. The city opened its gates without resistance, citizens lining the streets to see the legendary Maid. Among the crowd were people from Domremy, Joan's home village, who had travelled to witness her triumph. She met them with joy but also sadness. Her father Jacques was not among them. He had refused to come, still unable to accept what his daughter had become. That evening, as the army prepared for the final march to Reims, Joan found herself surrounded by admirers, noble and common, all wanting to touch her to receive her blessing, to be part of her story. She accepted their devotion with grace, but also growing unease. She was being treated as more than human, almost as a saint. It was dangerous, she knew, to be elevated so high. The fall, when it came, would be all the greater. Meanwhile, in Reims itself, chaos reigned. The city had been under Burgundian control for years, its garrison commanded by Jean de Châtillon, a Burgundian loyalist. But the citizens, learning of the advancing army and Joan's victories, were in open revolt. They wanted to welcome Charles, to witness a coronation that would restore legitimate kingship to France. On the morning of July 16th, even before Charles's army appeared, the Burgundian garrison fled Reims. They knew they couldn't hold the city against both external assault and internal rebellion. The gates stood open, the cathedral ready, the holy oil of Clovis waiting to anoint a new king. As the sun set on July 16th, 1429, Charles entered Reims in triumph. The streets were packed with citizens shouting, "Noel!" Church bells rang continuously. Flowers were thrown from windows, and at the centre of it all rode Joan, the peasant girl who had made this impossible moment possible. That night, as preparations for the coronation proceeded frantically, vestments located, ceremonies planned, nobles summoned, Joan kept vigil in the cathedral. She prayed before the altar, where tomorrow Charles would become truly king. Her voices spoke to her, not with new commands, but with approval. She had done what they asked. She had saved Orléans, cleared the Loire, and brought the Dauphin to Reims. But even in this moment of triumph, shadows gathered. Her voices also reminded her that her time was limited. She had achieved 2 of her 3 missions, lifting the siege and enabling the coronation. The third, driving the English from France entirely, would not be completed, not by her. She would be captured, her voices told her, before Midsummer Day 1430. Less than a year remained. Joan spent that night in prayer, torn between joy at her achievement and sorrow at the knowledge of what was to come. She had changed history, saved a kingdom, made a king, but the price for that achievement would be paid in full. The same divine providence that had elevated her would allow her to fall. The voices that had guided her to victory would also guide her to the stake. Outside the cathedral, the city of Reims celebrated through the night. Bonfires blazed in every square. Wine flowed freely. Musicians played and people danced. The impossible had happened. France had a true king again, or would when the sun rose. And it had all happened because a teenage girl heard voices and convinced a nation to believe in miracles. Tomorrow, Charles would be anointed with the holy oil that legend said had been brought from heaven by a dove for Clovis's baptism 900 years before. The sacred kingship of France, broken by the Treaty of Troyes, would be restored. The political impact would be enormous. A crowned and anointed king had legitimacy that no treaty could erase. But tonight belonged to Joan. She had kept her promise, achieved what everyone said was impossible. She had brought the Dauphin to Reims through enemy territory without fighting a single siege or losing a major battle. Towns had opened their gates at her approach. Enemies had fled rather than face her. In less than 3 months since leaving Domremy, she had reversed 100 years of English victories. As dawn approached on July 17th, 1429, Joan rose from her prayers and prepared for the coronation. She would stand near the altar, holding her banner, as Charles was transformed from pretender to king. It had borne the burden, she would say later, explaining why her banner deserved to share in the honour. It was only right that it should share in the glory. The coronation would be her greatest triumph. It would also be the beginning of the end. From this peak, there was nowhere to go but down. The voices had told her she would be captured, and the voices had never lied. But for this one perfect moment, as the sun rose over Reims and the cathedral bells began to ring, Joan of Arc stood at the pinnacle of achievement. She had done what she came to do. She had saved France. The cathedral of Notre-Dame de Reims stood ready on the morning of July 17th, 1429, its soaring Gothic arches and brilliant stained glass windows catching the early sunlight. For over 600 years, this had been the sacred space where French kings were transformed from mere nobles into God's anointed, where the temporal and divine intersected in rituals that trace back to Clovis and perhaps beyond. Now, after years of enemy occupation, it would serve its ancient purpose once again. The preparations had been frantic and incomplete. A proper coronation required months of planning, the gathering of peers and prelates, the commissioning of ceremonial robes and regalia. Charles had none of this. The crown jewels were in English hands at Saint-Denis. Many of the peers of France who should attend were dead, imprisoned, or allied with the enemy. The holy ampulla, containing the sacred oil of Clovis, had been hidden by the monks of Saint-Remy and had to be retrieved under armed guard. Yet somehow, in less than 24 hours, a coronation had been arranged. Archbishop Regnault de Chartres, despite his doubts about Joan, understood the importance of this moment. He had vestments brought from the cathedral treasury, arranged for a makeshift crown to replace the true crown of Charlemagne, and summoned every available noble to serve as witnesses. It would not be the most splendid coronation in French history, but it would be legitimate, and legitimacy was what mattered. The ceremony began at 9 in the morning. Charles, dressed in a blue velvet robe, decorated with gold fleur-de-lis, entered the cathedral to the sound of trumpets and the singing of the Te Deum. He looked, witnesses said, transformed. The perpetually anxious Dauphin who doubted his own legitimacy walked with newfound confidence. Joan had not only brought him to Reims, she had brought him to himself. Joan stood near the altar throughout the 5-hour ceremony, holding her banner, wearing her armour polished to mirror brightness. She was positioned where traditionally the greatest peer of France would stand, an unprecedented honour for a peasant girl. Some nobles grumbled at this breach of protocol, but none dared challenge it openly. She had earned her place through victory, a currency more valuable than noble blood. The ritual unfolded with ancient precision. Charles prostrated himself before the altar while the archbishop prayed for divine blessing. He took the sacred oaths, promising to defend the church, protect his people, and uphold justice. The archbishop anointed him with the holy oil on his head, chest, shoulders, elbows, and wrists, each touch accompanied by prayers that echoed back through centuries. When Regnault placed the crown on Charles's head and the peers present touched it in gesture of support, the cathedral erupted. "Noel! Noel!" the crowd shouted, the ancient cry of recognition. Trumpets blared. Bells rang out across the city. Charles VII was truly King of France, anointed with the oil of Clovis, crowned in the cathedral of his ancestors. No English claim, no Burgundian treaty, no military defeat could change this sacred fact. Joan knelt before her newly crowned king, tears streaming down her face. "Gentle king," she said, loud enough for many to hear, "now is fulfilled the will of God, who wished that I should bring you to your city of Reims to receive your holy consecration, showing that you are the true king and that France should belong to you." Then in a gesture that shocked the assembled nobles, Joan embraced the king's knees and wept openly. This was not the comportment expected in such a sacred ceremony, but Charles, moved by her emotion, raised her to her feet and publicly thanked her for all she had done. Some witnesses claimed he offered to ennoble her on the spot, though Joan refused, saying she wanted no reward but the completion of her mission. The coronation feast that followed was a strange mixture of triumph and tension. The great hall of the Archbishop's palace overflowed with nobles, clerks, and citizens of Reims. Wine flowed freely, and toast after toast was raised to the new king and the maid who had made his coronation possible. Yet beneath the celebration, divisions were already appearing. Georges de la Trémoille and Archbishop Regnault, who had opposed the march to Reims, now took credit for its success. They whispered to the king that Joan had served her purpose, that her peasant simplicity and religious fervour were now liabilities rather than assets. France needed diplomacy, not more war. They should negotiate with Burgundy, arrange a truce with England, consolidate their gains rather than risk everything on continued military adventures. Joan, sitting at the feast but eating little, she often fasted, consuming only bread soaked in wine, sensed the changing atmosphere. Nobles who had knelt before her at Orléans now barely acknowledged her presence. The king himself, while grateful, seemed distant, already listening more to his counsellors than to her voices. The unity of purpose that had carried them from Orléans to Reims was fracturing. That evening Joan dictated a remarkable letter to Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. Without the king's knowledge or approval, she begged Philip to end the civil war that had torn France apart. "Joan the Maid calls upon you by the King of Heaven, her rightful and sovereign Lord, to make a firm and lasting peace with the King of France. Forgive one another fully and willingly, as loyal Christians should. And if it pleases you to make war, then go against the Saracens. The letter revealed Joan's political naivety, but also her genuine desire for peace. She saw the conflict in simple terms. Christians should not fight Christians. The English were invaders who should return home. The Burgundians were French who'd been misled but could be redeemed. If everyone would just listen to God's will, as revealed through her voices, peace would follow naturally. Philip the Good never replied to Joan's letter. He was not interested in forgiveness or crusades against Saracens. He was a pragmatic politician who had allied with England because it served his interests. He would consider abandoning that alliance only when it no longer profited him, not because a peasant girl invoked heavenly authority. On July 21st, Charles left Reims, and the triumphal progress began to deteriorate into confusion. The king wanted to advance on Paris immediately, to capitalize on the momentum of his coronation. But his treasury was empty. Many of his troops were departing now that the coronation was achieved, and his councillors argued for negotiation rather than continued warfare. The army that had been unified in its march to Reims split into factions. Some towns, like Soissons and Laon, submitted to Charles immediately. Others, like Compiègne, welcomed him enthusiastically, their citizens lining the streets to touch Joan's cloak, as if she were a living saint. But the closer they got to Paris, the stronger the resistance became. At Château-Thierry, Montmirail and Provins, the pattern repeated. Initial resistance, followed by negotiated submission. But these negotiations took time, sapped momentum, and revealed the fundamental weakness of Charles's position. He was king by divine right, but not by military might. The English still held Paris, Normandy, and most of the north. The Burgundians still controlled the east. Charles ruled perhaps half of France, and that tenuously. Joan grew increasingly frustrated with the delays and negotiations. Her voices were urgent, warning that time was running out. She had perhaps until the following spring before her capture. Every day wasted in pointless negotiations was a day stolen from her mission. She began acting independently, leading skirmishes without royal approval, trying to force the pace of events. The crisis came in August when Charles, instead of marching on Paris, entered into negotiations with Burgundy. A 15-day truce was signed, during which Philip the Good promised to surrender Paris peacefully. It was an obvious delaying tactic, giving the English time to reinforce the capital, but La Trémoille and Regnault convinced Charles it was a diplomatic masterstroke. Joan was not even consulted about the truce. She learned of it after it was signed, a humiliation that showed how far her influence had fallen. The girl who had been the unquestioned leader at Orléans was now just another captain, and an inconvenient one at that. Her very existence challenged the councillors' policy of negotiation and compromise. If God truly spoke through her, why were they negotiating with his enemies? As August turned to September, Joan could wait no longer. With or without royal approval, she would attack Paris. She gathered what troops remained loyal to her. The Duke of Alençon, who had become her devoted supporter, contributed his men, as did other nobles who still believed in the Maid's mission. On September 8th, 1429, the Nativity of the Virgin Mary, Joan led an assault on Paris's walls. The attack on Paris was different from Orléans in every way. Paris was the largest city in Europe, with massive walls, a huge garrison, and a population that had prospered under English and Burgundian rule. Many Parisians viewed Charles not as their rightful king, but as the leader of the hated Armagnac faction that had brought civil war and suffering. When Joan appeared before the walls calling for surrender, she was met not with welcome but with crossbow bolts and insults. The assault focused on the Porte Saint-Honoré, where Joan personally led the attack. She stood on the earthworks before the gate, her banner visible to all, calling on Parisians to surrender to their rightful king. The response was a crossbow bolt that pierced her thigh, the wound she had been expecting since her injury at Orléans. Despite her wound, Joan refused to retreat. She had a fascine brought and tried to fill the moat, determined to reach the walls. But as darkness fell, with casualties mounting and no progress made, the Duke of Alençon ordered retreat. Joan had to be carried from the field, still protesting that the city would fall if they just pressed on. The failed assault on Paris marked the end of Joan's military ascendancy. She had suffered her first real defeat, and worse, she had been publicly wounded and forced to retreat. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded her since Orléans was broken. The English and Burgundians celebrated, claiming that the witch's power was failing. Even among the French, doubt crept in. Why had the assault failed? Had Joan's voices abandoned her? Or had she never truly heard them at all? Charles's response to the Paris defeat was devastating to Joan. On September 21st, he disbanded the army. There would be no more campaigns that year. He retired to the Loire Valley, to his castles and his councillors, leaving Joan with nothing to do but follow like an ornamental reminder of past glories. La Trémoille and Regnault had won. The policy would be negotiation, not war. The autumn and winter of 1429 to 1430 were agony for Joan. She was kept at court like a trophy, dressed in fine clothes the king provided, given honours and titles that meant nothing to her. In December, Charles ennobled her entire family, granting them the name du Lys and a coat of arms featuring a sword supporting a crown with 2 fleurs-de-lis. It was meant as recognition of her service, but Joan saw it as a farewell gift, a king's way of saying her work was done. She spent the winter in various royal castles, Bourges, Sully-sur-Loire, Jargeau, places she had helped secure but where she now felt imprisoned. Courtiers, who had once hung on her every word, now barely concealed their impatience when she spoke of continuing the war. The king himself, while always courteous, clearly preferred discussing his negotiations with Burgundy to hearing about her voices. Joan made one last attempt to revive her military career. In March 1430, without royal permission, she left court and began gathering troops on her own authority. She still had supporters among the common soldiers and minor nobles who remembered Orléans and Patay. By sheer force of personality, she assembled a small company of perhaps 200 to 300 men and headed northeast toward Compiègne, which was threatened by Burgundian forces. This independent action was unprecedented. Joan was essentially conducting her own war without royal sanction, funded by loans she secured on her own reputation. It was a desperate gamble by someone who knew her time was running out. Her voices had told her she would be captured before Midsummer Day, and that was less than 3 months away. As Joan moved through the countryside that spring of 1430, she found a different France than the one that had welcomed her the previous year. The great enthusiasm had faded. Towns that had opened their gates now demanded lengthy negotiations. Soldiers who had followed her anywhere now questioned her orders. The miracle of the previous year seemed increasingly distant, like something from a dream rather than recent history. Yet Joan pressed on, driven by her voices and her own iron will. She won minor victories at Malines and Lagny, enough to maintain her credibility as a military leader. But these were skirmishes, not the grand campaigns of the previous year. She was a captain leading a small company, not the saviour of France leading armies. In May 1430, Joan learned that Compiègne was under immediate threat from Burgundian forces led by John of Luxembourg. The town had been steadfastly loyal to Charles, one of the few places that had welcomed him enthusiastically during the coronation journey. Joan felt a personal obligation to defend it, regardless of the risk. As she approached Compiègne on May 22nd, 1430, Joan's voices spoke to her with unusual clarity. She would be captured soon, they said, before the feast of St. John. It was necessary, part of God's plan. She must accept it without despair, for through her suffering, she would ultimately triumph. The voices that had led her to glory were now leading her to capture, trial, and death. Joan entered Compiègne early on the morning of May 23rd, 1430. The town's captain, Guillaume de Flavy, received her with apparent enthusiasm, though some would later question his loyalty. Plans were made for a sortie that afternoon against the Burgundian positions at Margny, a village just north of Compiègne. It was to be a limited action, a raid to disrupt the Burgundian siege lines, rather than a full assault. The sortie began well enough. Joan led perhaps 500 men out of Compiègne's gates in the late afternoon, catching the Burgundians at Margny by surprise. The initial attack succeeded, driving the Burgundians back, but John of Luxembourg had more troops nearby and they quickly counterattacked. What had begun as a raid turned into a serious battle. As the Burgundian reinforcements arrived, the French began to retreat toward Compiègne. Joan, as always, remained with the rear guard, protecting the withdrawal. She had done this many times before, using her presence and her banner to rally troops and prevent retreat from becoming rout. But this time, something went wrong. The exact sequence of events remains disputed. What is certain is that, as Joan approached the gates of Compiègne, they were closed. Guillaume de Flavy, the captain, would later claim he had to close them to prevent the Burgundians from entering the town. Others suspected betrayal, that Flavy had deliberately trapped Joan outside. Whatever the truth, Joan found herself cut off, surrounded by Burgundian soldiers, with no escape route. She fought with desperate courage, trying to cut her way through to the gates, but she was pulled from her horse by an archer who grabbed her cloth of gold surcoat. On the ground, surrounded by enemies, she had no choice but to surrender. She gave her pledge to Lionel of Vendôme, a nobleman in John of Luxembourg's service, trusting to the customs of chivalry that guaranteed honourable treatment to noble prisoners. As news of Joan's capture spread through both armies, the reactions were telling. The Burgundians and their English allies celebrated as if they had won a great victory, which in a sense they had. The maid who had humiliated them at Orléans, who had destroyed their army at Patay, who had crowned their enemy at Reims, was finally in their power. Among the French the reaction was muted. Some wept for Joan, remembering all she had done, but many, especially among the nobility and clergy, secretly felt relief. The uncomfortable presence of the peasant girl who claimed to speak for God was gone. They could return to normal politics, to negotiations and compromises, without her inconvenient insistence on total victory. Charles VII's response to Joan's capture would forever stain his reputation. He made no attempt to ransom her, though he had the means to do so. He issued no threats of retaliation if she were harmed. He simply acted as if she had never existed, continuing his negotiations with Burgundy as if the girl who had given him his crown was of no consequence. Joan spent the first months of her captivity in relative comfort. John of Luxembourg kept her at his castle of Beaulieu-le-Fontaine, where she was treated as a noble prisoner. His wife and aunt visited her, curious about this famous girl. They found her courteous but unbroken, still insisting that her voices came from God, that her mission had been divine. It was during this early captivity that Joan made her first escape attempt, trying to squeeze between the bars of her cell. When that failed, she made a more dramatic attempt at Beaurevoir Castle, jumping from a tower 70 feet high. She survived the fall, found unconscious but miraculously uninjured, though she couldn't eat for several days afterward. She would later say her voices had told her not to jump, but she had preferred death to falling into English hands. The English, meanwhile, were negotiating to buy Joan from the Burgundians. They offered 10,000 livres, a king's ransom, for someone who was technically a commoner. But Joan was worth any price to them. She had to be not just defeated but discredited. If she was truly sent by God, then the English cause was damned. She had to be proven a heretic and a witch, her victories attributed to sorcery rather than sanctity. By December 1430, the sale was complete. Joan was transferred to English custody and taken to Rouen, the capital of English-occupied Normandy. She would never see Charles again, never return to the Loire Valley she had liberated, never again led French soldiers into battle. The military phase of her life was over. The spiritual and legal battle for her soul, and for the meaning of her mission, was about to begin. As 1430 ended, Joan found herself in a cell in Rouen Castle, chained to a wall, guarded by English soldiers rather than women, as church law required for a female prisoner. She was 19 years old. She had been hearing her voices for 6 years, fighting for France for less than 2. In that brief time she had changed the course of history, saved a kingdom, crowned a king. Now she faced a different kind of battle, one fought not with swords and banners, but with words and theology. Her enemies would use the full power of the Church and the Inquisition to prove she was a heretic. They would twist her every word, challenge her every claim, and ultimately condemn her to the flames. But even in this final battle, Joan would display the same courage, intelligence, and faith that had carried her from Domremy to Reims. The girl who had made a king would now become a martyr. The voices that had led her to victory would sustain her through imprisonment, trial, and death. And though the flames would consume her body, they would not destroy what she represented. Joan of Arc was about to become immortal. The castle of Rouen in January 1431 stood like a fist of stone clenched against the Norman sky, its towers and battlements embodying English power in occupied France. Within its walls, in a cell that was more cage than room, Joan of Arc began the final act of her brief life. She was chained by the waist to a heavy wooden block, the chain just long enough to allow her to reach a straw mattress, but not the window. 5 English soldiers guarded her constantly, men who took pleasure in tormenting the girl they called a witch. The conditions of Joan's imprisonment violated every norm of ecclesiastical law. As a prisoner charged with religious crimes, she should have been held in a church prison, guarded by women, allowed access to mass and confession. Instead, she was kept in a secular prison, watched by men who made crude jokes and threatened rape, denied the sacraments that were the centre of her spiritual life. The violation was deliberate, designed to break her spirit before the trial even began. The man orchestrating Joan's destruction was Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, whose very name, meaning pig in French, would become synonymous with treachery. Cauchon had been driven from his diocese by Joan's victories, losing the revenues and prestige of his position. The English paid him 1,000 livres annually and promised him the Archbishopric of Rouen if he delivered what they wanted. Joan condemned as a heretic, her victories attributed to sorcery, her king's coronation invalidated by association. Cauchon spent December 1430 assembling his tribunal with meticulous care. He needed theologians and lawyers whose verdict would be unquestioned, men of reputation who could give legitimate cover to what was essentially a political assassination. He recruited from the University of Paris, which had declared for the English, finding scholars eager to prove their loyalty to the occupation government. By January 1431, he had assembled over 60 assessors, though many would attend only sporadically, uncomfortable with what they were being asked to do. The most reluctant participant was Jean le Maistre, the Vice-Inquisitor of France. The Inquisition's involvement was essential to give the trial legitimacy, but le Maistre wanted no part of it. He delayed, claimed lack of jurisdiction, and finally had to be threatened with death before agreeing to participate. Throughout the trial, he would say as little as possible, a silent presence whose reluctance spoke volumes about the proceedings' true nature. The preliminary investigations began in January, with Cauchon sending agents to Domremy to gather evidence of Joan's heresy. They found nothing useful. The villagers testified that Joan had been exceptionally pious, charitable, and orthodox in her beliefs. The parish priest confirmed she had been a devoted Catholic. Even her childhood friends could provide no evidence of witchcraft or heresy. Cauchon suppressed these findings, never introducing them at trial. On February 21st, 1431, Joan was brought before the tribunal for the first time. The setting was carefully chosen for maximum intimidation. The Chapel Royal of Rouen Castle, its walls hung with tapestries depicting the torments of the damned. Cauchon sat in episcopal splendour, surrounded by theologians in their doctoral robes, clerks ready to record every word. Joan entered in chains, still wearing male clothing. The female garments she had requested had been denied. Joan had no advocate, no legal counsel, no one to advise her on the theological traps that would be set. She had asked for lawyers, but Cauchon refused, saying she must answer for herself. She requested that clergy loyal to Charles VII be included in the tribunal. This too was denied. She stood alone, a 19-year-old peasant girl, facing some of the finest legal and theological minds in France. The first session established the pattern that would continue for months. Cauchon began with seemingly simple questions designed to establish Joan's guilt through her own words. Would she swear to tell the truth about everything she was asked? Joan's response showed remarkable legal intuition. I do not know what you will ask me about. Perhaps you will ask me things that I will not tell you. When pressed, Joan agreed to swear to tell the truth about matters of faith, but not about her revelations, which she said were between her, God, and the king. This distinction between public faith and private revelation was theologically sophisticated, but Cauchon twisted it to suggest Joan was hiding something, perhaps demonic pacts or heretical beliefs. The questioning turned to Joan's voices. Here, the theological battlefield was treacherous. The church acknowledged that God could speak directly to individuals. The Bible was full of such examples, but the church also insisted it alone could determine whether revelations were divine or demonic. Joan had to defend her voices as genuinely divine, while avoiding the heresy of claiming authority equal to the church. This voice you say comes to you. Is it an angel? Or is it directly from God? Or is it the voice of a saint? Cauchon asked. It is the voice of St. Catherine and St. Margaret. Their faces are adorned with beautiful crowns, very rich and precious. How do you know they are St. Catherine and St. Margaret? I know it well. I can easily tell the one from the other. How do you tell them apart? By the greeting they give me. It is 7 years since they first began to guide me. The specificity of Joan's answers created problems for her interrogators. If she was lying or deluded, how could she maintain such detailed consistency? Over weeks of questioning, often designed to trap her in contradictions, Joan never varied in her essential descriptions. The voices were real to her, as real as the men questioning her. The trial record, preserved in meticulous detail by the notaries, reveals Joan's extraordinary presence of mind under extreme pressure. When asked if St. Michael appeared to her naked, she responded with withering sarcasm, "Do you think God cannot afford to clothe him?" When questioned about what language her saints spoke, she replied, "Better than yours," a jab at Cauchon's Norman French accent. But there were also moments of profound vulnerability. When asked if she was in God's grace, Joan gave her famous answer, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there. I would be the most sorrowful creature in the world if I knew I was not in God's grace." The assessors were stunned. It was, one later testified, an answer worthy of a doctor of theology. As the trial progressed through March, the focus shifted to Joan's male clothing, which became the central issue of her supposed heresy. The prohibition against cross-dressing came from Deuteronomy, but church law allowed exceptions for necessity. Joan argued she wore men's clothes for protection, both on campaign and in prison, where English soldiers constantly threatened her. She also claimed her voices commanded it, though she was less consistent on this point. Cauchon saw the clothing issue as his path to conviction. If Joan would simply put on women's clothes and keep them on, she could be condemned as a relapsed heretic if she ever wore men's clothes again. It was a simple trap that would avoid complicated theological arguments about her voices. But Joan refused to change her clothes while in English custody, knowing it would make her even more vulnerable to assault. The private examinations in Joan's cell were particularly cruel. Small groups of assessors would visit her, sometimes waking her in the middle of the night, asking the same questions over and over, trying to exhaust her into contradiction. Jean de La Fontaine, one of the more decent assessors, secretly advised Joan to submit to the church, warning her she would be burned otherwise. But Joan distinguished between the church militant on earth, which could err, and the church triumphant in heaven, which could not. She would submit to the church triumphant, she said, meaning God and her saints. This distinction was technically heretical. By claiming direct access to the church triumphant through her voices, Joan was bypassing the church militant's authority. But when pressed to submit unconditionally to the church militant, Joan gave an answer that revealed her understanding of her situation. As for the church militant, I will answer nothing more for the present. By April, the public sessions had ended. Cauchon had enough material to condemn Joan several times over, but he faced a problem. Many of the assessors were uncomfortable with the proceedings. Nicolas de Houppeville had been imprisoned for suggesting the trial was illegal. Jean de Châtillon had pointed out that Joan should have lawyers. Even some English clergy worried about the trial's legitimacy. Cauchon's solution was to reduce the charges from over 70 to 12 essential articles, which he claimed summarized Joan's testimony, but actually distorted it significantly. These 12 articles painted Joan as a sorceress, a heretic, a blasphemer, and a schismatic who refused church authority. They were sent to the University of Paris for judgment, ensuring the verdict Cauchon wanted. While waiting for Paris's response, Cauchon arranged for Joan to be charitably admonished, given chances to recant before formal condemnation. These sessions, held in early May, were exercises in psychological torture. Theologians lectured Joan for hours on her errors, threatening her with burning, describing in detail the agonies of the flame. Joan's responses varied from defiance, "I have done nothing but by God's command," to near despair. "If I saw the fire lit, the wood prepared, and the executioner ready to kindle the fire, and if I were in the fire, I would say nothing else, and would maintain what I have said until death." On May 9th, Joan was taken to the torture chamber and shown the instruments. The executioner stood ready, awaiting Cauchon's word. Joan's response was extraordinary. "Truly, if you tear my limbs off and drive my soul from my body, I will say nothing else. And if I did say something, afterwards I would always say that you made me say it by force." The assessors, to their credit, voted against torture, recognizing it would invalidate any confession. As May progressed, Joan's health deteriorated. She became ill after eating fish sent by Cauchon, leading to suspicions of poisoning. The Earl of Warwick, commander of Rouen, was terrified she would die before execution, supposedly saying, "The king would not want her to die a natural death for anything in the world. He has bought her too dearly." On May 23rd, Pierre Maurice, one of the more honest assessors, made a final attempt to save Joan. He begged her to submit to the church, to put on women's clothes, to say whatever was necessary to save her life. Joan's response revealed her complete understanding of her situation. "If I were already judged and saw the fire lit, the wood prepared, and the executioner who was to burn me ready, and if I were in the fire itself, I would say nothing other than I have said, and I would maintain it until death." The public admonition and threat of immediate execution was scheduled for May 24th in the cemetery of Saint-Ouen. A scaffold had been erected for the dignitaries, a stake prepared for Joan, and a cart waited to take her to execution. Guillaume Erard, a famous preacher, delivered a lengthy sermon on the dangers of heresy, calling Joan a monster and her king a heretic by association. Joan stood on her scaffold, able to see the executioner waiting with his cart. The crowd was enormous: English soldiers, French civilians, clergy, nobles, all gathered to witness either submission or execution. Cauchon read the sentence of condemnation, declaring Joan a relapsed heretic to be delivered to secular justice for burning. Then something unexpected happened. As Cauchon read, Joan interrupted. She would submit to the church. She would do whatever the church commanded. There was confusion on the scaffold. Some assessors shouted for mercy. English soldiers cursed, believing they were being cheated of their witches' burning. In the chaos, a document was produced for Joan to sign. What Joan signed remains one of history's mysteries. She made only a mark, she couldn't write her name, on a document she couldn't read. She later claimed it was a short statement, 7 or 8 lines, agreeing to wear women's clothes and submit to the church. But the document, later produced at trial, was much longer. A complete confession to heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft. Cauchon had apparently substituted documents. Though this could never be proven, Joan was returned to prison, her head shaved as a sign of her penance, given women's clothes to wear. She had escaped burning, but at the cost of denying everything she had lived for. Her voices, she had publicly stated, were illusions. Her mission was false. Her king's coronation was invalid. She had saved her life by destroying her meaning. For 3 days, Joan wore the women's clothes, but on May 27th, the guards found her in male clothing again. The accounts of why vary. Some witnesses said her guards had stolen her women's clothes and left only men's garments. Others claimed Joan said her voices had returned, telling her she had damned herself by denying them. Joan herself gave varying explanations, but the reason ultimately didn't matter. She had relapsed. Under church law, a relapsed heretic could be burned without further trial. Cauchon could barely contain his joy when informed of Joan's relapse. "Farewell, it is done," he allegedly told the Earl of Warwick. He immediately convened the tribunal, which declared Joan a relapsed heretic. The secular authorities, meaning the English, were notified to carry out execution the next day. Joan's last night was spent in prayer and tears. Jean Toumouillet and Martin Ladvenu, 2 Dominican friars, who had shown her kindness throughout the trial, heard her final confession. She asked repeatedly to receive communion, which should have been denied to a relapsed heretic. But Cauchon, in his only merciful act, allowed it, perhaps confident that nothing could now save her. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan was dressed in a long white shift and a cap inscribed with her crimes: heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater. She was placed in a cart and driven through the streets of Rouen to the old market square. The crowd was immense, perhaps 10,000 people gathered to watch. A high scaffold had been built so all could see, and the stake was raised on a plaster platform to make the spectacle visible from far away. Nicolas Midi preached a final sermon, taking as his text, "If one member suffer, all the members suffer with it." Joan listened patiently, then asked to pray. She prayed for nearly half an hour, forgiving her enemies, asking forgiveness for any harm she had caused, calling on her saints to help her. Many in the crowd, even English soldiers, began to weep. The executioner, Geoffroy Terrage, approached to bind her to the stake. Joan asked for a cross. An English soldier made a small cross from 2 sticks, which Joan kissed and placed in her bosom, but she wanted a proper crucifix to look upon while dying. The parish priest of Saint-Sauveur fetched the processional cross from his church and held it before Joan's eyes. As the fire was lit, Joan called out to her saints, to Saint Michael, to Saint Catherine, to Saint Margaret. She proclaimed once more that her voices came from God, that everything she had done was at God's command. As the flames rose higher, she called repeatedly on Jesus, her final word being, "Jesus!" cried out 6 times as the fire consumed her. The execution was botched in its cruelty. The scaffold was built too high, so Terrage couldn't reach Joan to strangle her before the flames reached her, the small mercy usually granted to those burned at the stake. Joan died slowly, in full agony, maintaining her faith to the end. Witnesses reported various miracles. Some saw Jesus written in the flames. Others claimed a white dove flew from the fire at the moment of her death. When Joan was dead, the executioner raked back the fire to display her charred body, proving to all that the maid was truly a woman and truly dead. Then he built the fire up again, reducing her body to ashes to prevent any collection of relics. The ashes were thrown into the Seine, though legend claims her heart wouldn't burn and had to be thrown into the river separately. The immediate aftermath of Joan's execution was not what the English had hoped. Instead of discrediting Charles VII, it created a martyr. The secretary to the King of England supposedly said, "We are all lost, for we have burned a saint." Terage, the executioner, was found that evening in a tavern, drunk and weeping, saying he had damned himself by burning a holy woman. Even among those who had condemned her, doubt crept in. Jean Alipé, one of the assessors, later said he wept for a month after the execution. Pierre Migier, prior of Longueville, said he wished his soul could be where he believed Joan's was. The English might have killed Joan, but they had not destroyed what she represented. In death, Joan achieved a kind of immortality she could never have imagined. The girl who signed her name with a cross because she couldn't write would inspire more books than almost any figure in history. The teenager who heard voices would become the subject of theological debates for centuries. The peasant who made a king would become the patron saint of France. But all of that lay in the future. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was simply dead, her ashes floating down the Seine toward the sea. She was 19 years old. She had changed history in less than 2 years of public life. She had saved a kingdom, crowned a king, and died for her beliefs. The voices that had guided her from Domremy to Rouen were silent at last. Or were they? For in a sense, Joan's voices would never stop speaking, echoing through history in the causes of all who fight against impossible odds, who stand against injustice, who refuse to deny their truth, even in the face of death. The morning after Joan's execution, Rouen seemed haunted. English soldiers who had cheered for the burning spoke in whispers. French citizens who had watched in silence now gathered in small groups, sharing stories of the dove, the name in the flames, the executioner's tears. The ashes in the Seine had dispersed, but something remained in the air: guilt, doubt, the uncomfortable possibility that a terrible mistake had been made. In the English strongholds across Normandy, commanders waited for the political dividend from Joan's death. Surely now the French would lose heart. Surely Charles VII, exposed as the follower of a condemned heretic, would lose legitimacy. Surely the war would return to its pre-Joan pattern of steady English victory. But the opposite occurred. Joan dead proved more powerful than Joan living, at least in the realm of symbol and inspiration. Charles VII, who had done nothing to save Joan, now found himself forced to defend her memory, to defend his own legitimacy. If Joan was truly a heretic, then his coronation, performed at her insistence, was tainted. If her voices were demonic, then his crown came from hell. The king who had abandoned Joan living now needed Joan dead to be innocent. But Charles moved cautiously, as was his nature. For 5 years after Joan's execution, he did nothing official about her case. He was still negotiating with Burgundy, still trying to find a diplomatic solution to the war. Raising the matter of Joan's trial would antagonize both the English and the church authorities who had condemned her. Better to let sleeping martyrs lie. The Treaty of Arras in 1435 changed everything. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, finally abandoned his English alliance and recognized Charles as the legitimate King of France. The reasons were purely practical. The English were losing, and Philip wanted to be on the winning side. But the treaty's symbolic importance was enormous. The civil war that had torn France apart was ending. The kingdom Joan had dreamed of, unified under its rightful king, was becoming reality. With Burgundy's defection, English power in France crumbled with surprising speed. Paris fell to Charles in 1436, the citizens opening their gates to the king Joan had tried to give them. Normandy held out longer, but by 1450 it too returned to French control. By 1453, the English retained only Calais of all their French possessions. The 100 Years' War was over. France had won. Joan's impossible prophecy had come true. It was only with victory secured that Charles finally turned his attention to Joan's memory. In 1449, as his armies entered Rouen where Joan had died, Charles ordered an investigation into her trial. The political motivation was transparent. He needed to clear his own name by clearing hers. But the investigation, led by Guillaume Bouillet, uncovered genuine irregularities that shocked even cynical courtiers. Bouillet interviewed surviving witnesses, examined trial records, and discovered the depth of Cauchon's corruption. The suppressed testimony from Domremy emerged, showing Joan's exemplary childhood. Guards confessed to stealing her women's clothes to force her into male dress. Notaries admitted to falsifying records under threat. The substituted abjuration document was exposed. The trial that had seemed so thorough, so legitimate, was revealed as a masterpiece of judicial fraud. But Charles needed more than a royal investigation. He needed the church itself to reverse its verdict. This required papal authority, and in 1452, Pope Nicholas V authorised a new investigation. But Nicholas died before it could proceed, and his successor, Calixtus III, had his own agenda. It wasn't until 1455, 24 years after Joan's death, that the formal process of rehabilitation began. The moving force behind the rehabilitation trial was not Charles but Joan's mother, Isabelle Romée. Now in her 70s, having lost her husband and seen her daughter burned as a heretic, Isabelle travelled to Paris to demand justice. On November 7th, 1455, in Notre Dame Cathedral, she presented her petition to the papal commissioners, breaking down in tears as she described her daughter's fate. "I had a daughter," Isabelle testified, "born in lawful wedlock, whom I reared in the fear of God and respect for the tradition of the Church, as far as her age and the simplicity of her condition allowed. Yet although she never did think, conceive, or do anything whatever which set her out of the path of the faith, certain enemies had her arraigned in religious trial. Despite her disclaimers and appeals, both tacit and expressed, they condemned her in a damnable and wicked trial and put her to death most cruelly by fire. I demand that her name be restored." The rehabilitation trial that followed was as thorough as the condemnation trial had been corrupt. Over the next year, 115 witnesses testified in sessions held across France. Childhood friends from Domremy described Joan's piety and charity. Soldiers who had fought beside her testified to her courage and faith. Even hostile witnesses from the original trial admitted to procedural violations and coercion. Jean Dunois, now one of France's greatest generals, testified about Joan's transformation of French military fortunes. "Before the Maid came," he said, 200 English could rout 500 French. After she came, 400 French could fight the entire English army." He described her prophetic knowledge, her tactical insights, her ability to inspire troops who had forgotten how to hope. Jean d'Aulon, Joan's faithful squire, wept as he described her capture at Compiègne. He had tried to follow her into captivity, but had been prevented. For 25 years, he had lived with the guilt of surviving when she had not. His testimony revealed intimate details of Joan's daily life, her fasting, her prayers, her tears for enemy dead, her joy in victory tempered always by sorrow for Christian blood spilled. Even more powerful was the testimony of those who had participated in condemning her. Jean Massieu, who had been the trial's usher, described Joan's final moments. She asked most fervently that a cross be held before her eyes. An Englishman who was present made a small cross from a stick and gave it to her. She took it devoutly and kissed it, making her lamentations to God, our Redeemer, who had suffered on the cross for our redemption. She put this cross in her bosom, between her flesh and her clothing. Several witnesses testified to posthumous miracles. Jean Riquier claimed he had seen Joan's name written in the flames. Pierre Cusquel, a stonemason, swore he had seen a white dove fly from the fire at the moment of her death. Others spoke of more subtle miracles: English soldiers who had cursed her dying of mysterious illnesses, French prisoners inexplicably freed, battles won against impossible odds after invoking Joan's name. The testimony revealed not just Joan's innocence, but the depth of popular devotion to her memory. For 25 years, despite official condemnation, people had preserved her story, named children after her, prayed to her in secret. In Orléans, the city she had saved, annual celebrations of her victory had continued despite English and Burgundian disapproval. Joan had become, without canonization, a folk saint. The Inquisitor General, Jean Bréhal, who led the rehabilitation proceedings, went beyond merely exonerating Joan. His summation was a devastating indictment of the original trial and a theological vindication of Joan's entire mission. Her voices, he argued, showed all the signs of divine origin. They urged her to virtue, to charity, to defense of the legitimate king. Her prophecies had come true. Her military success against overwhelming odds proved divine favor. Far from being a heretic, Joan was a martyr who had died for faith and country. On July 7, 1456, in a solemn ceremony in Rouen, the very city where Joan had burned, the Rehabilitation Court delivered its verdict. The original trial was declared contaminated with fraud, calumny, wickedness, contradictions, and manifest errors of fact and law. The 12 articles of accusation were torn from the records and publicly burned. Joan was declared innocent of all charges, a faithful Catholic who had died unjustly. Pierre Cauchon, who had died in 1442, was posthumously excommunicated. The other judges were formally censured, though most were dead or had fled. The University of Paris, which had endorsed Joan's condemnation, issued a careful statement distancing itself from the verdict. The English, who still held Calais, simply ignored the whole proceeding. But for Joan's family, the rehabilitation brought closure, if not comfort. Her brothers, Pierre and Jean, had fought in Charles's armies, trading on their sister's fame. They had been ennobled as the Du Lis family, though the title brought more prestige than wealth. Now their sister was officially innocent, a martyr rather than a heretic. It was something, though it could never bring her back. The rehabilitation, however, was not the end of Joan's story, but a new beginning. Cleared of heresy, she could now be venerated, at least informally. Churches were dedicated to her. Statues were erected. Plays and poems celebrated her deeds. She became a symbol of French nationalism, divine providence, and female courage. Each generation would remake Joan in its own image, finding in her story what it needed to find. During the wars of religion, Catholics claimed Joan as a defender of the true faith, while Protestants saw her as a victim of church corruption. During the Revolution, she was alternately condemned as a tool of royalty and celebrated as a daughter of the people who had risen from nothing. Napoleon declared her a French national hero, using her image to inspire his armies. The Restoration monarchy claimed her as a royalist martyr. The movement for Joan's official canonization began in earnest in 1869, when Bishop Félix Dupanloup of Orléans petitioned the Vatican to begin proceedings. The timing was not coincidental. France had just suffered devastating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, losing Alsace and Lorraine, Joan's homeland, to Germany. The nation needed its warrior saint more than ever. The canonization process was extraordinarily thorough, lasting over 50 years. Every aspect of Joan's life was examined. Her voices were subjected to medical and psychological analysis. Theories ranged from temporal lobe epilepsy to schizophrenia to deliberate fraud. Yet no natural explanation could account for her prophetic knowledge, her military success, or her theological sophistication. The Church required miracles for canonization, and 3 were eventually verified. All involved the healing of nuns suffering from cancer or tuberculosis after praying to Joan. Skeptics noted that all 3 nuns were French, suggesting national bias. But the medical examinations were rigorous, the cures inexplicable by natural means. The political implications of Joan's canonization were complex. The French Third Republic, officially secular and anti-clerical, nevertheless supported the cause, seeing Joan as a national rather than religious figure. Conservative Catholics hoped Saint Joan would inspire a religious revival. Liberals feared she would become a symbol of reaction. Feminists claimed her as a pioneer who had broken gender barriers. Traditionalists insisted she was an exemplar of obedient faith. Pope Pius X, who beatified Joan on April 18, 1909, navigated these controversies carefully. In his pronouncement, he emphasized Joan's personal virtues, her purity, courage, and faith, rather than her political actions. She was blessed not for making a king, but for obeying God. Her military victories were less important than her spiritual fidelity. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic theology. The beatification ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica was attended by 30,000 people, including representatives of the French government despite its official secularism. The paradox of anti-clerical republicans celebrating a Catholic saint was lost on no one. But Joan transcended such divisions. She belonged to all France, perhaps to all humanity. World War I accelerated Joan's final canonization. French soldiers carried her image into battle. The British, now allies rather than enemies, conveniently forgot their ancestors had burned her. Americans entering the war in 1917 adopted Joan as a symbol of righteous warfare. She became the patron saint of the Allied cause, her feast day celebrated in the trenches. On May 16, 1920, less than 2 years after the armistice, Pope Benedict XV canonized Joan of Arc in a ceremony attended by representatives of all Allied powers. The British cardinal who participated noted the irony without dwelling on it. The decree of canonization carefully avoided political statements, focusing on Joan's theological virtues and personal sanctity. She was declared a virgin, not a warrior, a martyr, not a nationalist, a saint for all Christians, not just the French. Yet the French claimed her anyway. The Parliament, still officially secular, declared May 8th, the date Orléans was liberated, a national holiday. Statues of Saint John appeared in every major city. The humble house in Domremy became a national shrine. Charles Péguy, the poet-philosopher, wrote, "The faith of Joan of Arc was the kind of faith that moves mountains." And it did move mountains. It moved the mountain of English power. It moved the mountain of French despair. During World War II, Joan's image became contested. The Vichy regime claimed her as a symbol of traditional Catholic France. The resistance saw her as an inspiration for fighting foreign occupation. De Gaulle invoked her name when calling for French liberation. Even the Germans tried to appropriate her, arguing she had fought against the same English perfidy that now threatened Europe. But Joan transcended all attempts to capture her for narrow causes. She remained what she'd always been, an impossibility that happened, a paradox that lived, a voice from heaven that spoke through an illiterate peasant girl. Theologians still debate her voices, historians still argue about her impact. Feminists, nationalists, Catholics, and skeptics all claim her for their own. Mark Twain, who spent 12 years researching her life, called her by far the most extraordinary person the human race has ever produced. George Bernard Shaw, in his play Saint Joan, portrayed her as the first Protestant, the first nationalist, the first modern woman. Carl Dreyer's silent film presented her as a pure spirit crushed by institutional power. Each interpretation revealed as much about its creator as about Joan herself. Modern science has tried to explain Joan through psychology, neurology, and sociology. Theories abound. She was schizophrenic, epileptic, or suffering from tuberculosis-induced hallucinations. She was a tool of court factions, a carefully coached imposter, a gender-dysphoric teenager seeking escape from traditional female roles. Each theory explains something, but nothing explains everything. The essential mystery remains. Perhaps that mystery is the point. Joan of Arc stands at the intersection of faith and reason, nationalism and universalism, tradition and revolution. She was deeply medieval, yet strangely modern. She heard voices no one else could hear, yet changed history everyone could see. She failed in her ultimate mission. She did not live to see the English driven from France, yet succeeded in ways she never imagined. Today, 600 years after her birth, Joan of Arc remains alive in human consciousness. In Orléans, they still celebrate her victory every May. In Rouen, a modern church marks the spot where she burned. In Domremy, pilgrims still visit her childhood home. Her name is invoked by revolutionaries and reactionaries, believers and skeptics, feminists and traditionalists. She belongs to everyone and no one. The young girl who heard voices in her father's garden has become immortal in the only way humans can, through memory, through story, through the endless retelling of an impossible life that actually happened. She remains what she declared herself to be at her trial. I was born for this. What this was, military victory, martyrdom, sainthood, or eternal mystery, perhaps even Joan didn't fully know. But whatever it was, she achieved it. The voices that called to Joan in that garden in Domremy still echo today, not as audible sounds, but as inspiration, challenge, and question. They ask us what we would die for, what truths we hold so dear that we would face the fire rather than deny them. They remind us that sometimes the impossible happens, that sometimes a nobody from nowhere can change everything, that sometimes heaven touches earth in the most unexpected ways. Joan of Arc died at 19, but she's been alive now for 6 centuries. The English burned her body, but they could not burn her story. The Church condemned her as a heretic, then canonized her as a saint. Kings abandoned her, then claimed her legacy. She failed, she succeeded, she died, she lived. She was Joan the Maid, Joan of Arc, the Pucelle d'Orléans, Saint John. She was all of these, and none of them. She was, in the end, exactly what her voices told her she would be. The Virgin who saved France, even if France could not save her. The year is 1461, 30 years after Joan's death. In a tavern in Orléans, an old soldier named Jean de Metz sits by the fire, his hair now white, his hands trembling with age. Young men buy him wine to hear his stories of the maid. She knew things, he tells them, his eyes distant with memory, things no village girl could know. The location of a sword buried behind an altar, the outcome of a battle, happening hundreds of miles away. The face of a king she'd never seen. He pauses, drinks deeply. I've fought in many wars since. I've seen brave men and cowards, saints and sinners, but I've never seen anything like her. When she looked at you with those dark eyes and told you God had work for you to do, you believed her. You had to believe her. This scene, repeated in countless variations across France, was how Joan first achieved immortality, not through official histories or theological treatises, but through the memories of those who knew her, fought beside her, watched her burn. These oral traditions, passed from veteran to child, from mother to daughter, kept Joan alive in the decades when the powerful wanted her forgotten. The stories evolved in the telling, as stories do. Joan's military prowess grew with each retelling until she became an undefeatable warrior who had never lost a battle, forgetting Paris, forgetting the minor skirmishes where she'd been driven back. Her prophecies multiplied until she had predicted everything from the death of kings to the weather on particular days. Her piety expanded until she was spending entire nights in prayer, living on nothing but communion wafers, levitating during Mass. But alongside these embellishments, kernels of truth persisted. The old soldiers always emphasized her kindness to prisoners, her tears for enemy dead, her insistence that English soldiers were not demons but misguided Christians who could be saved. The women who had known her spoke of her courtesy, her refusal to curse, her discomfort with the crude jokes of military camps. The priests remembered her devotion, her detailed knowledge of prayers and saints despite her illiteracy. These folk memories created a Joan more human and more divine than any official record. She became simultaneously the girl next door and the chosen of God, approachable yet untouchable, one of them yet set apart. In the villages of the Loire Valley, mothers would invoke her name to inspire courage in their children. In Normandy, even in formerly English territories, people would whisper prayers to her, despite the church's condemnation. The first written accounts began appearing within a generation of her death. Christine de Pizan, Europe's first professional female writer, composed a poem about Joan in 1429. While Joan still lived, it was the last work Christine wrote before entering a convent, as if Joan's appearance had fulfilled something she had been waiting for her entire life. I, Christine, who have wept for 11 years in a walled abbey, now, for the first time, begin to laugh. In 1429, the sun began to shine again. The rejected child of the rightful king of France, who had suffered so much, now comes as a crowned king. And all this has been accomplished by the maid, a young virgin. The chroniclers who followed were less poetic, but equally fascinated. The Journal du Siège d'Orléans, written by an anonymous eyewitness, provided detailed accounts of Joan's military operations, precise enough that modern historians can trace her movements day by day. The Chronique de la Pucelle, compiled in the 1460s, wove together testimonies from dozens of witnesses, creating the first comprehensive biography, but it was in the realm of popular literature that Joan truly flourished. The Mystery of the Siege of Orléans, a vast theatrical production requiring 3 days to perform, toured French cities for centuries. With a cast of hundreds, elaborate battle scenes, and machinery to produce miraculous stage effects, it was part religious pageant, part nationalist propaganda, part popular entertainment. Audiences would weep when the actress playing Joan forgave her enemies, cheer when she crowned the king, and riot if local authorities tried to cancel performances. These mystery plays served a crucial function in a largely illiterate society. They fixed Joan's story in popular consciousness more firmly than any written history could. Every major city had its own version, each emphasizing local connections to Joan. Orléans naturally focused on the siege. Reims glorified the coronation. Rouen, in a complex act of communal penance, staged elaborate recreations of the trial and execution, with the English portrayed as devils and Cauchon as Judas. The Renaissance brought new interpretations. Humanist scholars, rediscovering classical texts, compared Joan to ancient heroines, to Judith, who saved Israel, to Camilla, the virgin warrior of the Aeneid, to the Amazons who challenged Greek heroes. The comparison to Deborah, the biblical judge who led Israel to victory, became particularly popular. Both were women called by God to save their nations through military leadership. Both challenged traditional gender roles while maintaining religious authority. The Protestant Reformation created a paradox for Joan's memory. Protestant reformers, attacking Catholic corruption, should have championed Joan as a victim of a corrupt church, a simple believer who heard God directly without clerical mediation. Some did. The English Protestant historian Samuel Butler called her a noble spirit misled by popish superstition, but true to her own conscience. But most Protestants couldn't embrace someone so thoroughly Catholic in her devotions, so devoted to saints and sacraments. Catholics faced their own dilemma. Joan was increasingly popular as a symbol of faith, but her claim to direct divine revelation outside church authority, was troubling. The solution was to emphasize her submission to the church and her orthodox beliefs. She became a model of obedient faith rather than revolutionary inspiration. The wars of religion in the 16th century saw both sides invoke Joan. Catholic League preachers compared their struggle against Huguenots to Joan's fight against the English. Protestant pamphlets portrayed Joan as a victim of the same clerical tyranny they were fighting. Henri IV, converting from Protestantism to Catholicism to claim the throne, explicitly invoked Joan's legacy as someone who had united France across religious divisions. The Enlightenment brought the harshest criticism Joan had faced since her trial. Voltaire's mock epic La Pucelle d'Orléans portrayed her as a comic figure, mixing ribald humour with anti-clerical satire. For Voltaire and the philosophe, Joan represented everything they opposed: superstition, fanaticism, medieval ignorance. That a peasant girl's hallucinations had changed history proved the danger of religious enthusiasm. Yet even Voltaire couldn't entirely dismiss Joan. In his serious historical works, he acknowledged her courage and impact. This young girl gave to the astonished world an example of courage that men rarely give, he wrote. The Enlightenment's attack on Joan revealed its own limitations, its inability to acknowledge forms of truth beyond reason, its dismissal of popular agency, its contempt for the medieval world that had created the culture it claimed to transcend. The revolution initially rejected Joan as a royalist symbol. She had made a king. The revolution was destroying monarchy. She represented medieval superstition. The revolution championed reason. But as the revolution became a nationalist war against European monarchies, Joan was rehabilitated as a patriot who had fought foreign invaders. Napoleon explicitly invoked her when calling for resistance against coalitions of enemies. The Romantic movement embraced Joan with passion that would have puzzled the Enlightenment. For the Romantics, her voices were not hallucinations, but authentic spiritual experiences. Her medieval faith was not superstition, but organic connection to transcendent truth. Her peasant origins were not embarrassing, but proof that the simple soul could perceive what sophisticated minds missed. Friedrich Schiller's play Der Jungfrau von Orleans transformed Joan into a romantic heroine, torn between divine mission and human love. Though historically inaccurate, Schiller has Joan die gloriously in battle rather than at the stake. It captured something essential about Joan's story: the tragedy of someone forced to choose between personal happiness and transcendent duty. The 19th century saw an explosion of Joan literature, art and music. Every major French writer tackled her story: Michelet with nationalist passion, Alexandre Dumas with swashbuckling adventure, Anatole France with ironic skepticism. Painters competed to capture her image, Ingres showing her at Charles VII's coronation, Millet depicting her hearing her voices, countless others imagining her in armour, at prayer, at the stake. But perhaps the most remarkable 19th century treatment came from an unexpected source: Mark Twain. The American humorist, known for his skepticism and irreverence, spent 12 years researching Joan's life, learning French to read original documents. His personal recollections of Joan of Arc, 1896, published under a pseudonym because he feared it wouldn't be taken seriously under his own name, was a work of devotion. She was perhaps the only entirely unselfish person whose name has a place in profane history. No vestige or suggestion of self-seeking can be found in any word or deed of hers. When we reflect that her century was the brutalest, the wickedest, the rottenest in history since the darkest ages, we are lost in wonder at the miracle of such a product from such a soil. Twain's Joan was neither Catholic saint nor nationalist hero, but something more universal: the incorruptible individual standing against corrupted institutions, the voice of conscience in an age of cynicism. His interpretation influenced American understanding of Joan for generations, making her a symbol of individual integrity rather than religious or national identity. The late 19th century also saw the beginning of serious scholarly study of Joan. Jules Quicherat published the complete trial transcripts in 5 volumes, 1841 to 1849, making the primary sources available to researchers. Pierre Champion compiled documentation on every known person who had contact with Joan. Historians began distinguishing between the historical Joan and the legendary accretions, though they found the two impossibly intertwined. Medical and psychological theories proliferated. In 1879, Dr. Hubert Grimm diagnosed Joan with hysteroepilepsy, a fashionable 19th century diagnosis that explained everything and nothing. In 1904, Joseph Fabre proposed tuberculosis affecting the temporal lobe. In 1908, Georges Dumas suggested a combination of hysteria and mystical ecstasy. Each theory reflected contemporary medical fashion more than historical evidence. The early 20th century brought new artistic interpretations. George Bernard Shaw's Saint Joan, 1923, presented her as a prototype of Protestant nationalism, centuries ahead of her time. Shaw's Joan is intellectually sophisticated, articulating theological and political positions with eloquence the historical Joan never possessed. Yet Shaw captured something essential: Joan's absolute certainty and its collision with institutional authority. Cauchon. You are in effect saying that you are in direct communication with heaven, and that I, as Bishop of Beauvais, am not. Joan. How could it be otherwise? I am always in communication with heaven, for the saints speak to me every day. Carl Dreyer's silent film, The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928, took the opposite approach, using the actual trial transcripts as dialogue, employing extreme close-ups of faces, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere of spiritual crisis. Dreyer stripped away all historical context to focus on Joan's final ordeal. Maria Falconetti's performance, showing Joan's terror, doubt, courage, and transcendence without words, remains one of cinema's greatest achievements. These artistic interpretations coincided with Joan's official canonization in 1920, but they weren't simply Catholic propaganda. Shaw was a socialist skeptic, Dreyer a Danish Lutheran. Joan had transcended religious boundaries to become a universal symbol of spiritual integrity, resistance to oppression, and the power of individual conscience against institutional authority. World War I had made Joan newly relevant. French soldiers in the trenches invoked her as they faced their own, seemingly impossible odds. The British, now allies, conveniently forgot their ancestors had burned her. Americans adopted her as a symbol of the crusade for democracy. A medieval peasant girl had become a modern military inspiration. But it was World War II that most dramatically demonstrated Joan's enduring power. Both Vichy France and the Free French claimed her. Pétain's collaborationist government portrayed her as a defender of traditional Catholic France against modern corruption. De Gaulle's resistance saw her as an inspiration for fighting foreign occupation. The Germans tried to appropriate her as an opponent of British imperialism. The Allies invoked her as a martyr to tyranny. The most powerful wartime invocation came from the French resistance. Young women taking pseudonyms for underground work often chose Jeanne. The Maquis groups hiding in forests saw parallels to Joan's voices, calling her from rural obscurity to national salvation. The communist resistance, officially atheist, still found inspiration in the peasant girl who had challenged every authority of her time. After the war, Joan underwent another transformation. The feminist movement claimed her as a pioneer who had broken gender barriers, led armies, and refused to accept limitations placed on women. The fact that she had maintained her virginity, which earlier generations saw as holy, was now interpreted as resistance to male sexual dominance. Her male clothing became a statement of gender liberation rather than practical necessity or divine command. But this feminist Joan created new controversies. Some scholars argued that emphasizing her gender pioneering distorted her historical reality. Joan never challenged women's general role in society, only her personal exemption from it due to divine command. Others contended that Joan's example, regardless of her intentions, had expanded possibilities for women throughout history.